Hey, how are you?
Yeah.
We'd like to call this evening's meeting of the Peoria City Council to order. Welcome H. Wayne Wilson and his listening audience at WCBU as well as Cable Channel 22. Madam Clerk, the council microphones are open for roll call.
Mayor Artis.
Here.
Councilmember Akeson. Councilmember Sear. Councilmember Grayeb.
Here.
Councilmember Jensen.
Here.
Councilmember Montalongo. Councilmember Moore.
Here.
Councilmember Euler.
Here.
Councilmember Riggenbach.
Here.
Councilmember Ruckriegel.
Here.
And Councilmember Turner.
Present.
You have a quorum present, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We'd like to ask everyone to join us and stand for a moment of silent prayer or silent reflection, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we have several proclamations this evening, and we're going to start with the Eureka College men's basketball team. So we're going to ask them to join us down here at the center podium. I've got to get front and center so everybody can see.
You would do it.
Congratulations.
Thank you. For the record of athletics, you're Brian Moore.
Whereas the Eureka College men's basketball team captured their first St. Louis Intercollegiate Athletic Conference Tournament championship title with a 70-69 win over Webster University in St. Louis on February the 23rd. And whereas the Red Devils thus earned their first NCAA Division III tournament berth in program history, traveling to Lincoln, Nebraska to play top-ranked Nebraska Wesleyan University in the first round on March 1st. And whereas the Red Devils had two all-conference honorees with Peorians Dakota Bennington and Hank Thomas, and an all-defensive and all-academic selection with Alex Wigand. And whereas Eureka College represented the Central Illinois community with pride, persevering to win 5 of their last 6 St. Louis Intercollegiate Athletic Conference games to seize a conference tournament bid. And whereas Coach Chip Wild and the Red Devils never failed to stay the course, believe in one another, and compete with passion and integrity. Now, therefore, I, Jim Artis, Mayor of the City of Peoria, do hereby recognize the great work and the historic achievements of the 2018-19 Eureka College men's basketball team. You're welcome. I'm going to call you in just a second here. So, a lot of people don't think about it when we talk about all the great colleges we have right here in Central Illinois, and Eureka College is certainly one of them. And it's really an honor for us to bring the men's team down tonight and recognize them for this outstanding achievement in the tournament and their performance all year. Dr. Jamel Santa Cruz Wright has only been the president for a couple years now, but she's doing some outstanding work over there. I wish we had a little bit more time to talk about the relationship that the Peoria students have now and the opportunity that they have to attend Eureka College with the uniquely Eureka experience, which dovetails real nicely with Peoria Promise. But another time, another date, we'll get that information out there to make sure that people get that. But first, I'd like to ask the president if she'd like to say a few words, and then we'll have the coach come up and say a couple words too.
Thank you. Again. Mr. Mayor and all the councilmen and women present, as well as the citizens of Peoria, on behalf of the entire Eureka College community, I want to say first and foremost, thank you for this amazing honor. We are deeply humbled to receive this proclamation on this evening. And I want you all to know that I am exceedingly proud of these young men behind me, as well as Coach Wilde. And I tell you, one of the most famous quotes by a most famous coach in history is that success only comes before work in the dictionary. That was Vince Lombardi. And I have to tell you all that these young men behind me, as well as the coaching staff, put forth the work, and boy, oh boy, did they see the success as a result of the amazing work they put forth. So I am exceedingly proud of them. And they are both successful not only on the court, but also off the court. And that is equally important. Eureka College is so proud of the relationship that we have with the city of Peoria. The Uniquely Eureka Promise is just one example of said relationship. And as an extension of the Peoria area community, I also want you all to know that we could not be as successful as we are as a college. We could not be as elite as we are as a college or provide the type of educational experience that we do without the support and championing of the Peoria community. So for that, we thank each and every one of you all. Mr. Mayor, I want you to know that your influence and leadership spans far beyond the city limits of Peoria. And I greatly and deeply appreciate the relationship that we have and the partnership, and look forward to many, many more opportunities for us to partner in the years to come. So I'll keep my comments there for now by ending and saying, again, a thank you on behalf of the entire community. I want to bring up Coach Chip Wilde, who, again, has done an amazing job with these young men, not only this year, but I will say, as Chip is standing right next to me, and on behalf of myself and our Director of Athletics, Brian Moore, how wonderful Chip is and a great value to the Eureka College community, because he is not only a coach on the court, but he coaches these young men to become better people, better individuals, better citizens of our community. And again, for that, we greatly appreciate him. I am proud to have him be a member of the Eureka College community and would like to have him come forth and introduce his amazing team. Thank you so much.
Wow, this is awesome and nerve-wracking. So we're going to try to get through this, but I just want to obviously thank my administration for supporting us, but more importantly, obviously tonight, the city of Peoria. I know how important basketball is to the city of Peoria. I grew up in Macomb. I remember Stan Allback, and I remember Tony Baroni, and I remember some of those guys, and Dick Versace and those guys, and it's important. Basketball is important for us to be part of that tradition all the way through to the Sean Livingston days. It's really, really neat, really cool. And we do have other guys that aren't from Peoria, and I'm not from Peoria myself, but the fact that we get to be a part of your tradition in your great city, that's a really neat part of this evening. And then, of course, the other part of it is we do have guys from Peoria, and our championship would not have been possible with all of our guys, but it helps when your starting five is from Richwoods, Pekin, Peoria Christian, Metamora, and Washington. So we definitely embrace this honor from Peoria, from the city of Peoria. And let me introduce the guys that actually got like the points and the rebounds, because all I really did was kind of sit over there and drink Aquafina and just kind of cheerlead. So let me get to the guys that actually won the championship. Hold on a second. All right, we're going to go. You guys are going to have to kind of come around here so I can see who's all here. We got Drew Barth right here. Kind of raise your hand so they can see it. Kyler Stork, Jalen Crawford, Keith Waller, Drew Yonker, Andrew Parmenter, Nehemiah Butler, Kyle Henderson, Bryce Logston, Alex Wiegand, Hank Thomas, Devon Mack, and I call him D-Mac all the time. That was a hard one. Jaden Banks, Cameron Wise, Donald Hardaway Jr., Ryan McElmurray. He goes by Buck. That was a hard one, too, for me. Jalen Hosea, Kyle Robinson, Dakota Bennington, Jordan Dame, Austin Jurgens, Kobe White, my assistant coach, Ryan McElmore. Mulcrone. I said McElmurray. Ryan Mulcrone. I'll hear about that one. Thanks, you guys. My last thank you is my wife and daughter just walked in, too. I'd like to thank Darby and Zoe for coming tonight. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good evening. I'm here only quickly to express our deep appreciation for Eureka College, the president, it's just one the president of Eureka College and the college itself, and uniquely Eureka program. That's what I was trying to remember. Because that is a program that is taking our kids from all over the city, but specifically the kids that are being able to take advantage of it from the First District and the South Side to be able to get a 2-year degree through the Peoria Public Schools and then go on to Eureka and have an education that is supplied for them. That is outstanding. And I wanted to just be up here to thank Eureka College for all that you do. It is just absolutely amazing, and we couldn't do a lot of what we do without you. We are one region. We're not just Peoria and Eureka, but we're one region, and we need to support each other. And so I'm so glad to be able to come here and speak on behalf of Eureka College and this wonderful president. So thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Next, Councilmember Sears is going to join me for Parkinson's Awareness Month. Whereas Parkinson's disease is a chronic progressive disorder of the nervous system that affects movement for which there is currently no cure, and whereas 1 million people in the United States are currently living with Parkinson's disease, with an additional 50 to 60,000 new cases diagnosed each year, making Parkinson's disease the 14th leading cause of death in the United States, according to the Centers for Disease Control. And whereas increased efforts and awareness are desperately needed to help expedite the research efforts for better treatments, medications, and ultimately a cure, and whereas the American Parkinson's Disease Association provides the support, education, and research that helps everyone impacted by Parkinson's disease to live life to the fullest through research, patient and family services, education, and more. And whereas the world, the nation, and the state of Illinois observe Parkinson's Disease Awareness Month in April of 2019, now therefore I, Jim Ardis, Mayor of the City of Peoria, do hereby proclaim April 2019 as Parkinson's Disease Awareness Month in Peoria, Illinois. We have a couple speakers that are going to give us a little bit more information, but I'd like to recognize Councilmember Sear first.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Parkinson's disease is a terrible disease. There is no cure for it yet. A lot of progress has been made over the years, and we have some great people and great support people right here in Peoria. I've been involved myself just for a few years with these individuals, and it's just been a great experience for me. A lot of work goes into these people have invested in finding a cure for Parkinson. Roger and Barb Haleen, right there, I've been involved since the beginning, and I want to really give a lot of, give him his time tonight, really, to my buddy Ned Newhouse here. Ned is retired. He had to retire early from Caterpillar because of this disease, but Ned's been a true champion. He opened up with the help of some other people, and I got involved there. We opened up a gym. It's called Rock Steady Boxing. And Rock Steady Boxing has grown tremendously over the last 3 years. It's really all of it, really, because Ned's been really a champion to try to fight this disease. So I just want to give them the time. Thank you very much for all your work, and I'm glad to be involved with all these champions. Thank you very much.
Mayor Ardis, councilmen and women of Peoria, I'd like to thank you and the city of Peoria for doing this. With Parkinson's being a chronic neurological progressive disease, as Dennis said, there is no cure. There is medication that can slow the progression a little bit, help with the symptoms. But what we're dealing with is a medication that was developed before they put men on the moon. So with all of our advancements in medical technology that we've had over the years, they still have not come up with anything better really for Parkinson's than the main medication that was developed in the early 60s. Approximately 1 person every 9 minutes is diagnosed with Parkinson's. So during your meeting of approximately 2 hours tonight, there will be 12 to 14 people diagnosed with Parkinson's. Just something to think about as you progress through your meeting tonight, and how devastating it is for a number of people. The caregivers also take a toll helping the people with it. So I just want to thank everybody. If anybody wants to know more about Parkinson's, there's an educational seminar put on by the American Parkinson's Disease Association and the Central Illinois Support Group. It'll be April 6th at the OSF Jump Training Center. It's a free event. We have a number of very good speakers. Doctors from Illinois Neurological Institute will be there. Bill Bucklew, who has walked across the U.S. with Parkinson's, along with a number of other things. Excellent motivational speaker will be there. The event's free. It's at the Jump Center, starting at noon. Lunch is provided, so anybody that's interested in knowing more about it, please come out. I'm going to turn it over to Ned to say a little bit about his Rock Steady.
So thank you, Mayor Ardis and Councilman Sear and the rest of the City Council. As Councilman Sear said, Rock Steady Boxing is a program that's been developed. It started in 2006 in Indianapolis. It is now in 800 different affiliates around the world. Peoria was about the 75th affiliate back in 2015. We have about 50 members here that fight back literally every week. As Councilman Sear mentioned, I was diagnosed about 6 years ago in my mid-40s. It's a very devastating thing to be told you have Parkinson's disease, especially as a young person. But Rock Steady Boxing has given us hope. We've got a couple of our boxers here tonight, Barb Haleen, John Gomes, and Daryl Klusendorf. But I don't know them by those names. I know them by Kid Clue, Jigsaw, and Eagle Eyes, because we adopt boxing names. You know, you think of all the great boxers over the years, they all had good nicknames. So we try and do that to have a little bit of fun. And, you know, Rock Steady Boxing has given them hope and reason to be hopeful about their future. You know, I can't cure the disease for myself or for them, but we can make it more livable on a daily basis and help reduce the symptoms and the impact of the disease. Councilman Sear and his wife have been very supportive for the past few years, so I want to thank them for that, and thank you all for giving us a few minutes.
Next, we have the GMB Spring Celebration. For anybody that's wondering, it's GMB is, yeah, it's Gerald M. Brookhart, who is the namesake for this great event. And actually, we wish he was here tonight, but we'll probably save about 20 minutes because he's not. Whereas the Peoria County Regional Office of Education is committed to the establishment and continuation of programs that provide the opportunity for academic excellence. And whereas the Peoria County Regional Office of Education is further dedicated to supporting the development and promotion of programs in the fine arts and applied arts. And whereas the Gerald M. Brookhart Arts and Education Spring Celebration heralds the beginning of spring and now includes over 100 schools from 7 central Illinois counties: Peoria, Tazewell, Woodford, Fulton, Marshall, Henry, and McLean. And whereas this year marks the 34th year of the Gerald M. Brookhart Arts and Education Spring Celebration, which honors the arts and the talented students of central Illinois. And whereas the City of Peoria is pleased to acknowledge the Gerald M. Brookhart Arts and Education Spring Celebration from April 15th through May 17th, 2019, and recognizes the successful efforts of the Peoria County Regional Office of Education to enhance the quality of the academic experience of students in pre-K through 12th grade throughout central Illinois. Now, therefore, I, Jim Ardis, Mayor of the City of Peoria, do hereby proclaim April and May 2019 as Gerald M. Brookhart Arts and Education Spring Celebration Months in Peoria. We have Beth Kreider, our Regional Superintendent of Schools, and Mindy Watkins, who is the Projects Director, here with us this evening, and I think they'd probably both like to say a few words.
Just a few comments. Hi, I'm Beth, and if Jerry's listening, I always introduce myself as the new, better-looking Jerry M. Brookhart. Can you believe it's that time again? I am so grateful that we do this year after year. For 34 years we've been doing this proclamation because our students have been coming down to sing at the courthouse. For 5 weeks, 9 counties, thousands of children. That is art. That is supporting our children. We have a lot of serious things we need to talk about tonight and in the future. But one thing I know for sure is that we can support our children and as they work through the arts because it makes them a more whole child. So a couple special things that I want to let you know about. We are kicking it off this year in a partnership with the Riverfront Museum. Who likes jazz? Everybody likes jazz. Come down to Jazz Day at the Peoria Riverfront Museum. The Herbie Hancock Foundation, the Peoria Riverfront Museum, and the GMB are working together to have Jazz Day. You're going to hear some great bands, and if you don't know Mary Jo Papage, you're missing out. She's running that day. So come here. It's about 11 to 1 down at the museum. Beyond that, come hear a band. It will renew your soul, I promise you, and you will know spring has arrived. So with that, I am just so pleased to introduce Mindy Watkins, our new project director. We would love to have you come down, and if you're very bold, you can sponsor a stage. What does that mean? For $135, you can take the microphone and embarrass the child of your choice from the school of your choice. It's super fun. I did it to both of my children from the bands that they were in. So with that, thank you again for doing this every year, because it matters. It's economic development, it's the arts, and it's supporting our children. So thank you. Oh, one last shout out. Thank you so much to the Tourism Board. Their support, because they understand when children come, that means families come and grandparents come, and they go to the carts and they go to the businesses. And so we're very grateful for that small grant that allows us to do what we do. I didn't want to forget that part. Thank you.
I wasn't planning on saying anything, but I am a product of Peoria. I was born and raised here, and, you know, it plays in Peoria, and I'm really proud to be a part of it continuing to play in Peoria by becoming the new project director. I believe the first year this started 34 years ago, I participated from Concordia Lutheran School under the direction of Mrs. Janice Keeskin, and then continued on with Richwoods with Mr. Wayne McCumber. And without the direction of those two amazing music teachers, I don't know what I would do today. Music is a part of who I am, and continuing it in Peoria is also a part of who I am. And it is an amazing feeling down there at the courthouse, watching the tulips bloom on beautiful sunny days, even when it's cloudy. The colors come out, and hearing the music, seeing the art, watching the performers, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I'm so proud of Peoria and all of our sponsors that continue to help this grow, that this is in 34 years of success. And we are going to make it to 35 years and beyond that. So thank you to the City of Peoria and everybody that continues to help us grow. Thank you.
And last but not least, I would like to ask Chief Deputy City Clerk Stephanie Tarr to join me over here for a second. Is the clerk going to come up too? I think you should. Come on up. So today we're very proud to announce that Chief Deputy Circuit Clerk Stephanie Tarr has earned the designation of Certified Municipal Clerk, which is awarded by the International Institute of Municipal Clerks, Inc. IIMC grants the CMC designation only to those municipal clerks or deputy clerks who complete demanding education requirements and who have a record of significant contributions to their local municipality and community. The award was achieved on March 13th, 2019, and we just wanted to recognize and congratulate Stephanie on this achievement. Thank you.
You know, Stephanie was hired in 2012, and she was a transplant from Champaign, Illinois. She moved here with her 4 kids, and I thought, I don't know if she's going to stay or not, but I hope she did. And she stayed, and it has been a very welcome and addition to our office. She is one of the stars, and we appreciate her so much. She worked really hard for this certification, and it's it's not easily attained, and she has shown herself to be very worthy of it. So we appreciate her, and I just wanted her to be recognized tonight for her achievement. And I think that, you know, we have a great office, and I love all my people, and but Stephanie is very special. So thank you, Stephanie, for coming, for moving to Peoria and staying.
Thank you. Councilmember Graham.
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve the minutes of the Joint City Council Town Board meeting held on March 12, 2019 as printed.
Seconded by Councilmember Turner. Are there any corrections or changes to the minutes? Seeing none, please cast your ballots. That motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
We are at the consent agenda. 19-088 is a request to approve the award of HUD CDBG funds to Dream Center Peoria in the total amount of $400,000. 19-089 is a request to accept the low bid and award a contract to Kryling Roofing for the roof replacement at Fire Station 15 and 16 in the total amount of $145,997. 19-090 is a request to approve and authorize the execution of a one-year contract with Municipal Emergency Services for firefighter helmets, gloves, and self-contained breathing apparatus face pieces with Dingens fire equipment for fire gear and hoods to be purchased on an as-needed basis. 19-091 is a request to approve the annual subscription contract with ShotSpotter Incorporated for ShotSpotter Flex, a gunfire location alert and analysis service. 19-092 is a request to authorize the execution of a contract with Resource Management Associates in the amount of $33,887 to administer the Fire Battalion Chief Promotional Examination. 19-065 is a request to concur with the recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission and staff to adopt an ordinance amending Appendix A, the Unified Development Code, relating to donation bins. 19-086 is a request to adopt an ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Code of the City of Peoria regarding commercial uses of rights-of-way. 19-087 is a request to adopt an ordinance amending Chapter 27 taxation as outlined, and that is a part of the Code of the City of Peoria, pertaining to the calculation of the penalties for late payments of hotel, restaurant, amusement, utility, motor fuel, water utility, gas utility, and alcoholic liquor sold at retail establishment taxes. 19-093 is a request to concur with the recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission to adopt an ordinance rezoning property from a Class R4 single-family residential district and Class P1 parking district to a Class C1 general commercial district for the properties located at 3728, 3802, and 3804 North Prospect Road in Peoria, Illinois. 19-094 is a request to concur with the Planning and Zoning Commission and staff to adopt an ordinance approving a special use in a Class WH warehouse form district for waivers from the form district requirements relating to signage for the property located at 927 Southwest Washington Street. 19-095 is a request to concur with a recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission and staff to adopt an ordinance amending an existing special use ordinance 13221 as amended in a Class C2 large-scale commercial district for a shopping center to add freestanding signs for the properties commonly known as Northwoods Mall, which is in the area of War Memorial Drive and Sterling Avenue. And 19-096 is to approve a request to approve the committee report, which is the minutes of the policy session regarding tax increment financing. And that completes your consent agenda.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Items to remove from consent this evening. Councilmember Graham.
19-088.
088. Okay. Any other items to remove from consent? Councilmember Sear.
19-091.
091. Okay. Any other items to remove from consent this evening? Seeing none, I have a motion to approve the remaining items. Councilman Ruckriegel, seconded by Councilmember Euler. Please cast your ballots. That motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
Item 19-088 is a request to approve the HUD CDBG funds for the Dream Center.
Councilmember Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Black, I know we've discussed this before, and I've had questions asked of me by my constituents in reference to an organization that is religious in nature receiving federal community development block grant funds. I note that attached to the memo from staff here is a narrative from the Dream Center, and I think it's the second to the last paragraph. There is a sentence that the Dream Center of Peoria is proudly founded as a religious organization. However, as such, we also recognize the need to follow all grant required guidelines as specifically defined by HUD 24C FR 5-109D. We follow these guidelines. What are the guidelines?
Thank you, Councilman. I don't have that particular section of the federal code in front of me, but in general terms, federal funds can be provided to religious organizations for non-religious purposes. And so effectively what this section says is that there can be no religious test in order to use the funds, so that if funds were provided to a particular religious organization, then that organization would have to provide equal service to all persons who presented who qualified, and there couldn't be any test that said you're not of this appropriate denomination, therefore you have to move on. Second to that, there can't be any type of religious qualification in terms of a requirement to participate in a religious ceremony or to go through any type of religious indoctrination. So basically, the service needs to be open to the general public as much as members of the general public would qualify for whatever the program is, and those persons who are in the program do not have to become a member of whatever the religious affiliation is.
And I appreciate that explanation. We know the Dream Center does great work in our community, but these stipulations are there to make certain we have that wall of separation between church and state. And it wouldn't matter if this, whatever religious affiliation this would be, these particular regulations prevent the kind of thing you're talking about here. Therefore, they're eligible for the community development block grant funds. With that, I'd move to approve.
Okay, motion to approve, seconded by Councilmember Moore. Further discussion, Councilman Regenbach.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I see some Dream Center faces in the audience tonight, so we just want to publicly say thank you to you for the work that you did and that you do, and the way you stood up the gap when this need first presented itself. So that doesn't go unnoticed, and we hope that this shows the commitment that we have to the homelessness issue and to the work that you folks are doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I just wanted to briefly echo Councilman Riggenbach's sentiment. And also, there are so many activities that go on at the Dream Center. I don't think people realize how much is happening there all the time for lots of folks. And the Dream Center stands as a shining example of what happens when an organization cares about people and providing services to people, no matter what you look like, what you come with, just what service can they provide. So thank you all.
Thank you. I'll just add my quick thanks as well to the folks from the Dream Center who provide so much to our community. From a timing standpoint, the approval of this grant tonight probably couldn't come at a better time, as it's going to be followed up by a very important presentation from the Heart of Illinois Homelessness Continuum. So people that might not have a good understanding of just how important of an issue this is around the country, but right here too, this is coming at a very appropriate time. So not only am I proud to support the award of this grant, but I'm very proud to have the Dream Center in our city and all that they do. I'm not seeing any more lights, and we have a motion and a second to approve. Please cast your ballots. That motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
19-91 is a request to approve the annual contract with ShotSpotter Incorporated.
Councilman Sear.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a few questions for our chief. Question number one, what's our relationship with ShotSpotter? Relationship with ShotSpotter, how many years we've been doing business with them? And are they from Illinois? I know they're from California, but any businesses, any competition to them in our area? And do we put that business out for RFPs?
So we've been with ShotSpotter since 2013. That's when we initiated the phase 1, and the call center where the data goes to is in California. And as far as I know, I would have to research to make sure whether or not there are any places in Illinois. There are other vendors that offer a gunfire detection system, but I don't know if they're in Illinois or not.
Last question. When I see a price of $205,000 for this relationship, that's 2 or 3 officers on the street. Can you? Would it be better money better spent if we put officers on the street versus ShotSpotter?
Sure. And don't get me wrong, I'd love to hire more officers, but when you look at what the technology of ShotSpotter does, it's a 24/7 technology, and it pinpoints the location of where the gunshots are detected. 3 officers would not make a difference of the 6 square mile coverage that ShotSpotter covers. To have an officer on every street corner in that 6 mile area, it doesn't compare. And then what we're able to do with that technology and integrate it with our other technology that we have, we are correlating and putting together investigations that is showing that these investigations are connected to one another, thus helping us with our investigations.
Thank you very much, Chief. Thank you, Mayor. Move to approve.
Motion to approve, seconded by Councilmember Ruckriegel. Is any further discussion on this item? Councilwoman Jensen?
I pressed it by mistake. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Please cast your ballots. The motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk?
We are at the presentations. 19-097 is a request to receive and file a presentation by Kevin Nowlin, Director of the Heart of Illinois Homelessness Continuum of Care regarding homeless services.
Welcome, Mr. Nowlin.
Thank you, Mayor Artis and Council, for having me. My name is Kevin Nolan. I'm the Director of the Heart of Illinois Homeless Continuum of Care at the United Way, and I was asked to speak today a little bit about what's been going on with our interim shelter programs and our most recent homeless point in time count. So without further ado, so before I wanted to jump in, I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page with the homeless service providers in the Peoria area. As you can see on the screen, these are the homeless service providers working in the city limits. I do want to point out that we do have a street outreach program. It's a program operated by the Southside Office of Concern, and it is out actually on the street engaging people living in unsheltered locations to get them enrolled in services and hopefully to get them housed would be the goal. You can see our emergency shelter providers are up there, and then we do have a safe haven program. For all intents and purposes, it's an emergency shelter. The funding source has it designated as what's called a safe haven. We do have rapid rehousing programs. Rapid rehousing programs are for people that are on the streets or in shelter. They get them in private rentals in the community, and then assistance can be provided for up to 24 months, rent, utility assistance, security deposit, and case management, so that those people can remain housed once that assistance ends. And then, of course, our most intensive service is permanent supportive housing, and it's designated for highly vulnerable individuals that typically have one or more disabling conditions. So before I get into the interim shelter, I wanted to kind of talk about the history a little bit. We did have what was called a day drop-in center operating in Peoria. It was at the Salvation Army downtown here, and it was a place where individuals that are homeless would go during the day. They would get some services, but they would eat, they would socialize, and ultimately it was a place to go in between an overnight COTS program where they spent the night at, right? So they'd be at a COTS program, they'd leave with their stuff, they'd walk down to the street, they'd go to the day center with their stuff, they'd leave the day center, they'd walk back to the COTS program, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that grant ended in July of 2016, and as a result of that, the doors closed. So we had all these individuals that were homeless that were showing up in our parks, in our library, and all over the community in front of businesses. And of course, the city of Peoria recognized this as an issue, as well as the county and the Heart of Illinois United Way, and they said, well, we'll come up with some temporary funding to reopen this day center so we have a place where people can go during the day. They gave a year time frame to allow that funding. With that came a call to action to the Continuum, saying, okay, Continuum, you're going to have to come up with some sort of strategy or some plan once this assistance ends. And we're given a timeline to do that. So what we knew at the time is we had these overnight programs that weren't effective, right? We had these COTS programs. A person would come in, they'd check in, they'd eat dinner, they'd get a bed, they'd sleep overnight, they'd leave in the morning and take all their stuff with them. Maybe go to the day center, maybe go to the library, maybe go somewhere else, right? But there was little to no opportunity for case management, and those programs at the time were operated by the Dream Center and the Salvation Army. Our data proved that it wasn't successful. We had a 9% success rate of people exiting those programs to permanent housing, so it wasn't successful, right? It was a place for people to sleep at night. So we had a strategic planning task group of the Continuum that got together and said, well, this is an opportunity. Let's create a system that's going to be effective in ending homelessness and getting people from homelessness into housing, right? So create a model to do that. So we came up with this interim shelter model. 1 or 2 locations open 24/7. No time frame for the conclusion of services, mean people can stay for as long as they need to or until they get permanently housed. Of course, case management involved with that, and then, of course, food, laundry facilities, things like that. It had to embrace a housing-first philosophy, which all that means is when somebody comes into shelter, your goal is to get them housed as quickly as possible. So somebody checks in, how are we going to get you housed, right? You're focused on housing regardless of barriers, regardless of vulnerabilities that the people have. That's sole focus, right? And then it also has to be one that's based in harm reduction. All harm reduction means is people can make their own choices. And based on their choices, it doesn't impact their housing. So for an example, somebody can choose to participate in case management or not. If they choose not to, that doesn't mean they can't stay in my interim shelter, right? Also, it has to be an access point for all other resources that flow through the continuum, meaning once I come in there, all those other housing resources have to become available to me. So the continuum released a request for interest and put it out there to see if there is agencies or entities that would be willing to do this. And we received 2 responses. The Dream Center said, we'll be willing to do it. We can serve single women, couples, households with children, and we can increase our bed capacity by 35 to have 95 beds available. Salvation Army also stepped up and said, we'll be able to do this too, and we can serve single men with 58 bed capacity. Unfortunately, the Continuum lacked the resources to fund both. We were able to come up with the funding to fund the Dream Center to get that operational, but we didn't have the resources needed to also fund the Salvation Army. And what we did at that point is we met with OSF to gauge their interest in supporting that. OSF has been a great partner to the Continuum and continues to be a great partner to the Continuum. And OSF has had a strong focus on the social determinants of health, which is what outside in this person's life is going on that's impacting their health. In this case, the person doesn't have housing, it has an impact on their health, right? Poor health outcomes. So OSF said, yeah, this is something that we'd be willing to support. OSF was also interested in the data, right? Does getting people placed in permanent housing decrease emergency room utilization? So they wanted to look at that. It's something to pay attention to. So again, they were willing to support that with a caveat. They wanted a licensed mental health provider to be on site at the Salvation Army Safety Net to provide the case management services. So that's when the Southside Office of Concern came to the table. As a licensed mental health provider, they are now on site there, 12 hours a day providing case management services to the residents there. Why the Southside Office of Concern? Well, they have a proven track record of success. Southside Office of Concern works with the most vulnerable clients that we deal with, and they get them housed and keep them housed. So it was a perfect fit. Also part of this was looking at the data, right? Right now, the Continuum is giving OSF identifying information about the individuals staying at the safety net program, and OSF is able to cross-reference that with their records internally to ultimately determine if, when people get housed, are they not using emergency room services, and do they have better health outcomes? Just as an example, and I know this is hard to see, so I'm going to walk through it. This is a gentleman that was served at Safety Net. Going back to 2012, he had 48 ER visits. Okay, and of those 48 ER visits, 44 times he was taken to the ER by an ambulance. Okay, so this gentleman came in an interim shelter and has since been placed in permanent housing, and he hasn't been to the ER since. So this is a very positive outcome. This is data we're going to continue to analyze to see if we can continue with these results. Speaking on the data level, what kind of data have we seen with our interim shelter model? We're serving more people, and our outcomes are greater. We have increased the number of people we're serving in our interim shelter model by 26%, which means people are accessing and using the service, which is great, but probably more importantly, we've increased the rate of people exiting to permanent housing by 33%. So that's pretty dramatic. What we're going to continue doing, we're going to continue looking at this data. We want to pay close attention to that ER utilization rate and permanent housing placement. We want to keep working on service engagement. As I talked about earlier with people can choose to participate in case management or not, but we know if they choose to participate in case management, outcomes are greater. So how can we better engage these folks to get them to want to participate in those services? We need to keep looking at resources outside of the continuum for housing placement because we don't have enough beds for everybody. And ultimately, we're going to come back later, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months down the road, and see those people that exited these programs to permanent housing if they stayed permanently housed or if they returned to homelessness. So shifting gears to the homeless point in time count. Nationwide, there's a homeless point in time count. It takes place the last 10 days of January and every year. It's where we count individuals who are homeless and also collect some demographic information about these folks. Ultimately, this information goes to Congress, and Congress uses that information to determine what resources they want to dedicate towards homelessness in the United States. We also use that internally to look at our gaps and our needs and how we want to prioritize things locally. We held our most recent count on January 23rd, 2019. I'm very pleased to report that we saw a dramatic decrease in the number of individuals that are homeless in our community. We actually dropped from 400 down to 285, and we saw a decrease in all homeless categories: emergency shelter, transitional, unsheltered, and safe haven. In fact, it's the lowest point in time count we've ever had. We started collecting this data back in 2009, and we were well below the average count. So we're definitely moving in the right direction towards ending homelessness in our community. Coupled with this point in time count is we look at our inventory. I'm proud to report that our governing board saw a need to increase our permanent supportive housing beds over the last couple of years, and those beds are dedicated to highly vulnerable folks, right? Those folks that are going to remain homeless and most likely die on the streets if there's not some sort of intervention. So you can see a dramatic increase in our permanent supportive housing beds. We've had 120 new beds come online to serve this population since last year, so that's great news as well. I'm very happy that you guys elected to support the Dream Center tonight. As I mentioned earlier, the Dream Center has had a 26% increase of folks that are serving there. They certainly need the resources, so we appreciate that. And they're also having the outcomes, and they're getting more people placed in permanent housing, so we appreciate that. I also noticed on the agenda that there is some discussion about a strategic plan towards affordable housing that the city wants to get involved in, and the Continuum would certainly appreciate that and be happy to partner in those efforts if that's the will of the council. I do want to make a point to thank Ross Black and the community development team. They have been instrumental in a lot of work in the Continuum. They participate on a lot of our committees and boards, so I do want to thank him for that. So that's it for me, unless you have any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Do we have any questions for Kevin this evening? Councilman Jensen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nolan, or Kevin, since I know you. Just wondering about, because I don't think it was included, the statistics about our homeless situation here in Peoria. Has it increased over the years since you've been at the consortium, or is it about the same?
So in our most recent point in time count, we decreased dramatically. It was our lowest count. Last year was 400, and this year was 285. So we've seen a decrease.
That's good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great news. Great news.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilman Ruckriegel.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. And I'd just like to acknowledge the hard work that's being done. It was when I made the transition onto council, I was at the library board and on the board at that time, and that was a transition summer where some of those day drop-in services were lost. And what it did, I think, for the community was truly put a face on homelessness. Because if you came into, especially our downtown library, that was a place where they found shelter in the day, especially if it was raining or inclement weather. And as we moved to winter in that time frame, there was this impetus for the United Way to partner with the city of Peoria and also Peoria County. And I think that not only did they find a temporary solution to get us through that winter, which was the first goal, but I think that we see the numbers here in the metrics on where they're moving, and can't say enough about the good work that's happening with the Continuum. So please thank all of your partners, because I think that the data shows here and what you've discussed tonight really do show the movement that's happening.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks to the library, too. The library does some case management down there, and they're very accommodating of the folks that come in there, so we appreciate that as well.
Councilmember Moore.
Mr. Nolan Allen, thank you for your presentation. I have to tell you, you went through these pages like no one I have ever seen go through. So that's a talent. Your last point about affordable housing, recently the National League of Cities brought together a national housing task force, of which I'm a member of that task force. And so if you don't mind, I will be reaching out to you because the city has taken the steps to actually be proactive in this space. And there will be more information coming on that, but just look for my call because your offer to assist with a strategic plan is going to be taken.
I appreciate that. That's our greatest need, is we lack affordable housing for our folks that we serve. We have these highly vulnerable folks that we definitely want in permanent supportive housing, but then we have people that are homeless because of some sort of crisis or something that happened that don't need those long-term supports, and if they just had opportunity for affordable housing, then their situation would end it, and they most likely won't return to homelessness because they'll be living in a property that they can afford.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any more lights. Thank you very much for the presentation. We appreciate it. We have a motion to receive and file. Councilman Graham, seconded by Councilmember Ruckriegel. Please cast your ballots. The motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
19-098 is a request to receive and file the month ended January 31st, 2019 unaudited financial report.
Mr. Scroggins.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We brought this back at the request of Councilman Sear to kind of give you an overview of the direction we're going under our new financial software. Historically, in the past, we've had two reports come forward to the council, one from the treasurer, which was the cash basis report, and one from myself, which was on the modified accrued basis. With the conversion to our new software, to prepare cash basis reports very labor intensive because the software doesn't work on a cash basis. It works on a full modified accrued basis because it's a full accounting system. So the treasurer and I got together and we're working on creating a report that will serve the purpose for both of us. So that will also reduce the number of reports coming to council to 1 a month versus 2. The report that we presented last week is a start. We're open to suggestions as far as if you'd like to see something changed. I know just looking at it, sometimes it's harder to read, so I'm already looking at changing the format because I think the numbers are hard to read. But going forward, if there's any suggestions that you have that you would like to see, any information, more detail, less detail, the reports that we're getting from the system are more detailed than what you were getting historically. So if that's more than what you need, let me know. We can refine this report. So that's really all I have as far as that goes.
Questions for Director Scroggins, or we have the City Treasurer here as well. Anything specific that you would like to see it added to this? And if not, I'd accept a motion to receive and file. Councilmember Euler, seconded by Councilmember Ruckriegel. Councilmember discussion, Councilmember Regenbach.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Director and Mr. Treasurer. I think this is really good information. I think it's probably going to take us a month or two to figure out what the best way to present it all is and what is too much and what's not enough. But I think this really helps us, you know, if we take the time to go through it to get a current, even though it's January, get the current feel and pulse of where we are. So I think this is really good information. We just got to make sure that we have it in the format that it makes sense to everybody. So thank you for the efforts.
Councilmember Ruckriegel.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. And I would echo those words. Great information. I guess my request, and I don't know if this is necessarily for the Finance Department or for our City Manager, great information for us as we look through this, but I'd love to be able to, and I think it's needed, a quick one-page dashboard that comes out each month. Some of those numbers may be in arrears because of sales tax information coming backwards, but I think that as we continue to look at our finances over the next couple of years, and as the public continues to look at our finances, if we can get down to a 1 or 2 pager on a dashboard that is very easy diagrammed, that the public and us can have the same conversation, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further lights, we have a motion to receive and file. Please cast your ballots. That motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
19-099 is a communication from the City Manager with a presentation from Fitch and Associates concerning the fire and dispatch service study.
Mr. Manager.
Thank you. We have with us this evening, we have Bruce Moeller and Stephen Knight from Fitch and Associates that are here to discuss the engagement that they had with the city pertaining to fire and EMS services inside the city of Peoria. They have a slide deck presentation that they're going to walk through. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Moeller here to have him walk through that. I think we'll let him go ahead and get started with that.
Welcome. Make sure that switch is on.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Bruce Moeller. I'm a senior consultant with Fitch and Associates. With me tonight also is Dr. Stephen Knight, who is in charge of the fire practice of the firm and also a partner in the firm. What I want to do tonight is briefly walk through a presentation which summarizes where we are right now in the engagement. We're coming to the end of what I'm going to refer to, at least for this evening, as phase 1. There's one piece that's remaining that in conversations with the city manager we were asked to take on additionally, and where we're at with that and kind of the time frame for completion of everything. As a matter of introduction and methodology, I want to talk about what we were engaged in when we originally began. The manager had established a committee of stakeholders in our initial time here on site in the city. We met with those. That included members of the council, obviously, city administration, fire department, members of the labor group, 911, representatives from the hospital systems, including the medical director, health department, etc. Now, one of the things very unique in the firm is we're very data-driven. In other words, the data ultimately tells the story. So we have the conversations from kind of a qualitative perspective, so we recognize what the concerns are in the community and what issues we should be focusing on. But ultimately, we want the data. And the way that we want the data is we want raw, original data from your computer-aided dispatch system, which is tracking everybody's movements in the system, the demand for call, the type of call they went on, and we collected that for the initial analysis. We use that historical information then to actually do some modeling, and the modeling is done using a geographic information modeling software, so we can do what if. What if we make a change in the system to the left or the right? When we were here in October of last year, at the request of the city, we sat there and provided an interim briefing at that time of what the study had showed. We had done the analytics on the data, so we had a fair amount of information, provided that, and provided what we kind of called it at the time, a range of alternatives that the city would be able to consider moving forward, kind of some bookend options. The council did, in the budget cycle, make some adjustments to the system as it exists today. Those were implemented, so we're recognized of that, and we'll continue kind of taking that into consideration as we finalize the first phase of the report. The most significant work most recently, and I'm going to explain a little bit more, is we engage stakeholders, particularly with regard to the way that the system responds to emergency medical calls, which represent the great majority of calls that the fire department responds on in conjunction with AMT, or American Medical Transport. And then again, the last piece that we have yet to finish has to do with looking at the 911 center, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What I can tell you is that when we look at public safety, law enforcement, fire, EMS, it is almost always true that if you make a good investment in the 911 systems, that you've got high confidence in what kind of event is happening, you can ensure that you send the right resource to the right call, and you can make the system both more effective and more efficient. So I will build into that a little bit more as I go through this. The methodology that we use, as I said, very data-driven firm. We collected 5 years of data out of the computer-aided dispatch system used by your fire department, your 911 center, and also that from AMT. And what we did is we had to merge those two data sets together into a single database to understand when an incident happens in the community, emergency with a citizen, how we respond to that, or how you respond to that. Most of the data that we report on today, I'll be talking about, it comes from 2017, the calendar year. And what I want to talk about for just a moment is something that we do in this business called average versus 90th percentile. If you look at that, there's a couple pieces here. There's two things that we want to understand when we're evaluating a system. There's actually not just one component. People think of response time, but the response time has components. From the time the incident's discovered, we have to discover the event first, and somebody grabs the phone and dials 911, until the 911 center can dispatch emergency responders, that's a segment or component that needs to be understood, how quickly that processes, how accurate it is. The second element is once the crews are notified, they have to mobilize. They have to get ready, get out to the apparatus, get on the vehicles, and start responding to the call. And then the last component that we generally look at in system design is response time, or the travel time, which is from when the wheels start rolling until they arrive at the scene of the emergency. In total, we call that total response time. Sometimes we like to call it hello to hello time. You dial 911, somebody answers, that's the first hello, until the firefighters, the paramedics, law enforcement is standing on somebody's doorstep, the second hello. On the right side of this graphic, you'll notice, remember the old bell-shaped curve? I hate to go back in math, but the old bell-shaped curve? The distribution isn't quite like that, but the line in the center is the average, right? If we assume calls occur, and if we measure the system looking at averages, that's the way most people think about it. When people ask, how quick does it take your fire department to get there? We give them an answer. Most people are thinking on average. Here's the problem from a policy perspective. if you design a system on averages, it's like a coin toss, because 50% of the time you're going to meet the number, and 50% of the time you won't meet the number. So the practice in the industry is we design and evaluate systems at the 90th percentile. So 90 times out of 100, with a high degree of confidence, you can say, we will meet this benchmark, we'll meet this requirement to get somebody help in an emergency. So as I go through this, you're going to see some places where we look at the 90th percentile because that's more telling for us. In the past few weeks, as we've been preparing for tonight, we did get some questions about the data that we used, how we analyzed it, so I do want to take, if I can, just a moment to talk about that very briefly. The firm actually employs 3 different doctoral level, all PhDs, statisticians that do our work. In this particular engagement, it was Dr. Erwin Stradowski, we just call him Irv, Dr. Irv, a graduate of MIT, a senior researcher with Monsanto, and actually has been a consultant to NASA. Not quite a rocket scientist, but if you talk to him, a little bit of that. He's the one that did the analytics. He took the raw data and ran the analysis on it. When he was done, Dr. Knight reviewed that as the senior partner, also the partner for the fire program. I reviewed that data as well, because I was the primary consultant on the project, as well as Mr. Fuentes, who's the chief operating officer, and also a partner in the firm. So we all looked at it. The 3 of us together have over 70 years of, over 70 years of experience in fire and emergency medical services. I would prefer tonight if I don't have to disclose how many of those 70 years are mine. But we have a lot. Dr. Knight and I both have quite a bit of experience at the university level teaching. Actually, this semester I'm actually teaching a course on these sort of techniques at the University of Florida. And then, of course, both Dr. Knight and Mr. Fuentes have significant experience accrediting fire rescue agencies or 911 centers. In November, shortly after we were here in October, we finished up the draft data report. We shared that with the fire department, asked them to go through it, look at it. Again, we don't expect them to redo the math, but we do say, look at it, make sure it makes intuitive sense to you. There's no obvious errors or omissions. They did that for us. The chief actually did provide a good comment, which I'll come back and talk about a little bit later in the end, where we modified our procedures. And then again in January, we also asked for information from the department because we recognized they were working on accreditation, an accreditation process that the fire service uses in order to demonstrate to their community, to their elected officials, that they're providing the sort of level that you want, of service that you want. When we looked at their data, we did recognize some differences, so there was a question about that. I just want to address it briefly. We go for raw data, the original data out of a computer-aided dispatch system. It's data that basically isn't modified in any way. It comes directly out of the system. It captured events in real time. The department uses, as many of them do, the records management system. After an incident closes, that data is transferred over to a record system. Most agencies do that. And they had done some analysis on it, so we kind of looked at what they did versus what we did. We found a few unusual findings. One of them had to do with call processing time. For example, you'll see 3 highlighted numbers there. For a certain classification of EMS calls, medical calls, they said it happened in 1 minute and 7 seconds 90% of the time. But for a different class of medical calls, it happened at 3 minutes and 18 seconds, the 90th percentile. Reasons we just didn't quite understand why. That 318, by the way, aligns very closely with what we found of 3 minutes and 1 second. There will always be differences when you use a different data source with different analysts, and frankly, the software vendor that the fire department selected, the city selected, when they came in, we don't know exactly how they extract the data, what filters they apply, the specific methodological techniques, so there's always going to be a little bit of a difference. But when we analyzed all of this, we still remained highly confident with the data we had prepared from the original report. Excuse me. I have a little of a cold coming in, I think. Let me switch now to the workload in the system. We needed to look at both fire activity and medical activity. In 2017, there were over 27,000 incidents that both AMT and the fire department responded to. Now, when we use the term an incident, it's talking about an event, a single emergency. Let me give you the example of a vehicle crash. There's a bad vehicle accident, people are injured. That is one incident, that is one event. But to that single event, you will send your police department, you will send your fire department, you will send AMT will get dispatched to transport the patient as needed. So there will be multiple responses. In the middle column, number of incidents shows you the count overall, 27,000, of which 22,900 were related to EMS. And then 2,700 for fire activity by the fire department, et cetera. On the right column are the number of responses. For example, a structure fire has a lot more vehicles that go to that single event than a medical event will have for a moderate or low acuity call. And of course, what we see here is that 87% of the activity in the system is related to EMS. That's a truism we see across the nation. It's changed dramatically in the last 3 decades. According to the National Fire Protection Association, based on national data, in the last 3 decades, the number of structure fires in this nation have been cut almost in half, as well as the number of fire fatalities, fire injuries, etc. In many ways, the fire service has been very successful in addressing the fire problem we first identified in the late 60s and early 70s. Not the same with EMS. In that same time period, 3 decades, the number of medical calls that fire departments go on has grown exponentially. It's up 250 to 300% in many communities. Peoria, like many, appear to reflect that change. For the public in particular, I know when we met with some of the council members, we highlighted this. It's always important for policymakers to understand this, as well as the administration. The chief and his personnel certainly know this, that when you look at when emergencies occur, they don't occur the same every hour of the day. You are a lot busier at 4 o'clock in the afternoon than you are at 4 o'clock in the morning. So there's a temporal distribution of call. People go to sleep, nighttime, the calls drop dramatically. They pick back up during the daytime, stay high, and around midnight start dropping off again. We also see a difference in where calls occur. They are not evenly distributed throughout the community. What you want to do in the design of a system is try to capture 90% of the calls. As elected officials, I'm sure you've heard the term, is the chief still here, police chief? No, the fire chief is. The old expression, there he is, thank you, chief. We always say you can't afford a cop on every street corner. Some communities say that. At a certain point, just the additional cost for an additional station, an additional unit, an additional may or may not yield the results that you want. You have to calculate how that's going to be. So in designing a system, you try to make sure you cover 90% of your risk. It ultimately is a risk management piece. You want to cover at least 90% of your risk. That doesn't mean the other calls don't get answered. They just may not get answered in exactly the same time. Instead of let's say a 5 or 6 minute travel time, it may be 6 minutes and 10 seconds or 6 minutes and 15 seconds. So we also analyze where the calls occur and attempt to locate resources in those areas where they're most needed to provide the highest level of performance. And what is that performance in the system today, or at least with the data we had? On the screen, I talked about those 3 elements. The time it takes to handle a call in the 911 center, the time it takes for the crews once they're notified to get in the vehicles and get moving, and then what we call travel time, and then the total time overall. And we looked at those both at the average, which is what we generally suggest you report to the public. Having a 90% discussion doesn't work well, in the community, but at least among policymakers, the department administration normally would, and at the 90th percentile. Several things jumped out at us. Travel interval at the 90th percentile for your fire department is 4 minutes and 32 seconds. I'm looking at Dr. Knight now. Probably the top 2, 3 that we've seen out of probably 100 engagements. Your fire department's ability to get there quickly, once they're notified, once they're moving, extremely high. Dispatch interval, 3 minutes and 2 seconds. That we see as an opportunity. That we identified as something that was a bit outside what we normally see, and so we see an opportunity there, which is why, I'll come back in a second, what we're talking about at the end. And working on those elements can provide additional benefits to the organization overall or to the community overall. One final thing that we kind of looked at is something called unit hour utilization. It's, if you think of it as workload or time on task, if you look at an individual unit, each of the vehicles, how much time they spend actually performing their primary role. There's a line up at the top at the 0.3 representing 30%, an orange line. That line represents what the International Association of Firefighters recommended in their first edition of the EMS guidebook should be the maximum amount of time you want to, excuse me, the maximum amount of time you want a vehicle tied up. Now this time only includes that while they're actually on an emergency. The crews have many other things to do. There's training. They have to come in the morning, check out their equipment. When they're done handling a call, they've got to come back and do paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't want a unit busy so much of the time as you would maybe think in a business environment. You don't want them running 50, 60, 70% of the time. First, you're going to burn them out. The second thing that will happen is that unit will not be available when you need them for another call, right? I have to have a certain amount of availability in the system so there's somebody always available to respond. This graphic to us reflects that there is availability in the system. You're not at a critical juncture, as we see with some other clients that we have, that they're running so many calls you have to add more resources. So that's positive news. And of course, when looking at EMS, we had to consider what was going on with AMT. So in taking the two databases and putting them together, we analyzed how quickly the fire department shows up versus how quickly AMT shows up. The majority of time, the fire department shows up first as the first responder. That's actually kind of the way you design the system. AMT shows up, trying to remember exactly, about 27% of the time first. But the real key kind of interesting piece here is the last bullet point on this one. When we looked at the system overall, what did we conclude from all these graphs, tables, charts, analytics? What we say is this. First off, your response times are generally quite strong, especially the travel time in your system. You've got good coverage, you have good availability of units. The dispatch component, that's an area that's an opportunity. You have capacity in the system. The units are not so overworked that we would say you need to add additional units. One thing that kind of jumped out, though, is that AMT, on average, arrives on scene behind the fire department in 1 minute and 46 seconds. And this is going to seem counterintuitive, but that actually isn't necessarily the best thing you want, because you've got two resources deployed arriving essentially at the same time. And in the great majority of cases, you don't need those two units arriving at the same time. Let me talk about that a little bit more here. Let's talk about the science behind how you design an EMS system. And this has changed a bit from the early days. I will date myself, going back to Squad 51, Emergency, Johnny Gage, Roy DeSoto. Anybody? Okay, a few of you, all right. What we do now is a little bit different. First off, with regard to fire service and fire protection and structure fires, there's been recent work done by, on the left, Steve, that was Underwriters Labs, right? Underwriters Labs on the left and UL/the U.S. Fire Administration on the right. Modern construction, modern materials that are being used have actually made it slightly more dangerous today, because the growth of fire, the point at which a fire becomes what we call comes to backdraft, occurs much more rapidly than it used to. The data is very busy. I'll interpret it this way. The black line is what you worried about. In the legacy environment, you had 15, 20 minutes until you had to worry about a backdraft. Today, that's occurring in 5 to 8 minutes. Backdraft is a situation that when even a firefighter in full protective gear is caught in a room that flashes over, they have moments, not minutes, they have moments to extract themselves from that. When a flashover occurs in a room, you are not going to have somebody survive that event with almost certainty, not complete, but almost certainty. So the way fire behaves now is different than it used to. Fire service now is considering different ways of approaching fires and our tactics and our techniques. In an EMS, where it was always response time, always response time, always response time, get there as fast as you can, here's what we came to understand. In a significant number of the cases, it doesn't have as much importance. It certainly does in highly acute cases to arrive rapidly. But that's about 85%. I mean, 85% of the time it's not that way. 85% of the time, the research has demonstrated that if you don't get there within 5 minutes, between that 5 and 11-minute window, it's not going to change the clinical outcome. I use this example all the time. I'm walking around up here. If I tripped and fell right here, right? I did not lose consciousness. I didn't hit my head. I just fell. I hurt myself. My knee, my ankle, my wrist. Whether I get somebody here in 2 minutes, in 12 minutes, or 20 minutes, the literature says will not change the outcome, clinical outcome, for me. I may be happy or unhappy with the service level, but from a clinical perspective, it's not going to make much of a difference. And increasingly, we're recognizing there are more and more incidents that are like that. The 5 minutes, from the time something starts, it happens, until the time that somebody has to be at the bedside or in the home mitigating the fire, that all really needs to occur within about 5 minutes, 90 times out of 100, to have an effective outcome. Now, the good news is that's about 15% of the calls that come in to 911 centers, about 15% of the time. So the trick is to quickly identify those calls that need that level of response and put everything into those. But 85% of the times, up to about 12 minutes, you're not going to change the outcome much, at least not the clinical. So in designing a system, we're seeing the best practices, more progressive systems, recognizing this and adjusting their response in order to sit there and take advantage of these facts. As I said, we did some GIS modeling. Some of this, some of you may have seen before. Your system right now operates 90 times out of 100, 4 minutes and 32 seconds travel time. That's what we use in the modeling, the way the computers work. We looked at the model put in the way the system was designed today, and it showed that at 5 minutes you were hitting about 87%, which is very, very close to what the actual performance is. Because the model, frankly, here's what the model does. It assumes it's us driving, it's Google Maps or Waze, right? You go from here to there. So the modeling is always a little bit slower than what the fire department can do, because the fire department has the advantage of big red trucks with lights and sirens. They always outperform a little bit. But that modeling was very close. So as an example, if you're performing today at 5 minutes, I'll go back to that, all of your stations are needed to hit that level of performance. We made a statement, I want to say it here again, because if you change one parameter, you can change things dramatically in the system. Only as a matter of illustration, if there was a decision to say, look, we know we're getting there basically in 5 minutes now, let's take the foot off the gas just a little bit, and get there in 6 minutes instead, you can get essentially that same level of performance from only 6 locations. You may still need more of the units, but 6 physical locations would do it. And so in designing systems, you look at those factors. Where they're deployed, where the demand is, what's the time parameters you're trying to meet? How busy is it? Sometimes a single station will require multiple units because you have lots of calls in that area. So we compared those things in the modeling and coming up with the alternatives that we had talked about before, and also how many units are needed. One of the things that we did in the data is we looked at the system, based on historical data of how the system performed when you had less units available. We actually looked at the system every time you had every unit available in the system, every time you had 1 unit that was tied up, 2 units tied up, 3 units tied up, 4 units tied up. And again, speaking to the resilience, the capacity, the depth, the term from football, right? Your depth chart, how deep you can go. You have very little change when 1 unit's tied up to, in the current system on the left side, that text in the lower left. From the average overall, if you had 4 units less in the system or 2 units less in the system, let's say 2 units, it changes the average 16 seconds in the system. Significant, not significant? Again, policy calls. That is not statistically significant. At least I can share that part with you. So it shows again that the system had capacity and had some resilience. This was the issue I mentioned that the chief had mentioned to us in the draft data report we had shared. We looked at something called effective response force. It's not always just the time to get the first unit there. If it's a structure fire, you need lots of people. In the industry, we normally look at that for it's normally analyzed for a single family home, and you need 15 personnel on scene. So we said, how long would it take to get that number of people on scene? We looked at the way the system was currently designed, and then two alternatives that actually came from the city. The one alternative, Chief, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I got these right. Closing of Station 8 and rebuilding Station 4 at a new location was option one. Option two was the 2 rescues that you ended up reducing in the budget this year. And we compared what impact that has on the city's ability, the department's ability, to effectively get that effective response force there. From the current effective response force to option one, option two, frankly, you don't see much of a difference. There isn't much of a fluctuation. You still are able to deliver an effective response force at essentially the same level as what you're doing today. So we evaluated that based on 8 minutes, which comes from the National Fire Protection Association. The 10, 12, and 14 are derived from the Commission on Fire Accreditation, just various benchmarks, the way different groups look at it. So with all that, we saw the systems. But I want to go back for a moment to dispatch, because one of the things we did see in the medical response, there were some opportunities, not just in the amount of time, but we also noticed this, that the fire department went to an awful lot of medical calls. And the literature has increasingly become clear, as I said, that single, simple trip and fall. In a significant number of cases, sending multiple units to the same call is not a best practice. It is not an efficient use of resources. So what was done is Mr. Fuentes, like I said, Chief Operating Officer, massive amount of experience running, designing EMS systems, worked with a group of your folks, including Dr. Jackson, the systems medical director, 2 members from the fire department, 2 members from AMT, and the 911 director. And they looked to revise and take advantage of this literature. What they did is they looked at the research that was out there, some of which I've already alluded to, on cardiac arrest literature. They looked at information on what we call ALS versus BLS for the audience. ALS is advanced life support. Think of it as paramedic level work. BLS is basic life support. Think of it as somebody that's not a paramedic, an EMT, emergency medical technician. And it's interesting because the literature has evolved a lot now. Generally, advanced life support, paramedics are seen to have the greatest value in a non-traumatic cardiac arrest, the classic heart attack. But if you're talking a trauma victim, somebody who suffers a stab wound or a gunshot to the chest, what the literature is increasingly showing is the greater benefit is from rapid transport. Don't do a lot of procedures in the field, move quickly to a hospital. And here's an interesting, unique characteristic of Peoria. You have great medical resources literally within minutes of most areas of the community. So this group that I described looked at that information, and they recognized something else, that the way you dispatch calls today really doesn't reflect the granularity, the complexity of the system the way that it is. Your 911 center actually uses something called medical priority dispatch. I'm sure most of the audience has seen those television news stories where there's a medical emergency, somebody dials 911, the baby's not breathing, and the dispatcher talks the parent how to help the child in that critical point of time. That's half of the MPDS system. That's what we call pre-arrival instructions. What they never talk about is the front end, where they quickly categorize the call. And it doesn't take long, by the way. Somebody calls 911, what's your emergency? I don't know, my husband, something's wrong with him. Is he conscious? No. Is he breathing? I don't think so. You're done. I have all the information I need to know how to respond to that call. That is a high priority call. Today, your system uses 121 different dispatch codes. This MPDS system I'm talking about has over 1,300. And what the group of your fire department, AMT, and your medical director put together, working with Mr. Fuentes, was a system that uses those 1,300 codes and breaks them down into 14 different response methods. Let me give you an example here. This is a fall. The card is a version of that. There's also a computer version. And it classifies calls into major categories. This happens to be a 17, which is a fall, and it can go into one of 4 categories. In this card, it's Alpha, Bravo, and Delta, A, B, and D. But the system overall has really 6 categories. It has Omega, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, and Echo, with Deltas and Echoes being the most serious calls. And so the group looked at that, went through every one of those, and thought, what's the best way to respond? Now, this one's a little confusing, but I think it's worth for the council to hear this. So I talked about Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. You see those are the main categories. Subsequently, in earlier revisions years ago, they added the Echo, which are the most acute, the highest priority calls, and the Omegas, which are the lowest. Most people think it's linear. It's not. It's not linear. If you notice between on the top going across the top between BLS and ALS, it says capability. There are times in this system, the best practice is that you don't need to send paramedics because you've talked this through. Go back to the fall. I fell. Are you conscious? Yes, I'm conscious. Are you alert? Yeah, I'm alert. Did I hit my head? No, I didn't hit my head. I just tripped and fell. That doesn't require paramedics. That requires somebody to come help get me up and, if necessary, take me to the hospital. There's other times you do need paramedics. The system also considers, based on who's going, whether they need to respond hot or cold. Hot is lights and siren. That's what we think of. But increasingly, we recognize, communities are recognizing, more so from a risk management perspective, it doesn't make sense to send somebody or multiple units screaming across the city, lights and siren, for somebody that simply fell and twisted their ankle or hurt their knee. So applying that kind of logic, the group sat there looking at your experience and came up with the way the system operates today versus how it could operate in the future. And I want to emphasize something. This really is a medical decision and an operational decision. It's why I involved your fire department, AMT, and your medical director, Dr. Jackson. And what this system looks at, this table does, looks at the impact on the fire department. Starting from the top line, Omegas, what would happen is, in the last year, the best we could determine, you had 141 of those, really very small number. It's not necessary for the fire department to go to those. The Alpha calls, you could reduce the majority of those. Not all of them, but a majority of those. The Bravos, the Bs, well, that was interesting. There were actually some of those subcategories, when you break it down the way the system works, where the decision of that group was the fire department needs to go to a few more of those than they are now. So they would actually go to a few more of those. And the Deltas and Echoes, the highest priority calls, the most significant ones people think about, everybody goes all the time. There's no change. Everybody goes to those. Here's what that allows to happen. The fire department would not need to respond to those lower severity calls. And because they are not responding to low severity calls, an overall reduction of about 2,400 calls a year, 15%, they are available more of the time to respond to the critical calls. This is quite clearly the best practice in emergency medical services across the nation. Increasing number, certainly all the high-performing EMS systems utilize systems like this. Because what you're really doing is sending the right resource to the right call. So the opportunity exists for the fire department to go to less of the low priority calls, make themselves available for the higher priority calls. The system has greater effectiveness and efficiency, and it allows AMT to handle some of those calls by themselves without worrying about bothering the fire department, again, on the low priority calls where you don't need multiple units. It's an effectiveness and efficiency thing. Now, AMT today has an internal target of 8 minutes and 59 seconds. Their franchise agreement, our understanding is with their franchise agreement, calls for them to arrive in 9 minutes and 59 seconds. the recommendation was to move that 1 minute to 10:59, and also in the process work with the dispatch center, which has to be worked on first, to reduce their call processing time down at least by that minute, if not maybe a little bit more. So the hello to hello time stays the same. You've introduced where EMT units, basic life support units, can be utilized in the system that are slightly less expensive to staff but easier to staff, because paramedics are hard. As you see in the dispatch center, it's more difficult to hire dispatchers, high turnover rates. EMS has the same problem with paramedics, so you add that. And you have a system that is more nimble, a system that increasingly recognizes what is the call and send the appropriate resource to that call, based on literally decades of utilization of these systems. Surprisingly, it was surprising for us when we were here the first time. I know Mr. Tuttle isn't here, the 911 manager. But Dr. Jeff Clausen, the guy who came up with this system back in the late 70s, early 80s, he was the one that actually came here and helped install the system here in Peoria. For years, you've used this system, but you've used it more for the pre-arrival instructions. You haven't fully embraced it. The increasing demand for medical calls, changing dynamics in healthcare, looking and considering effectiveness and efficiency in the system, improving it, having greater availability of the fire department to respond to the critical calls, says utilize these best practices in order to make that happen. It is the decisions on alpha calls and bravo calls and who goes to what. Those were made by your folks. They weren't made by us. We facilitated the process. But they reviewed the literature. They looked at those, that information. They're the ones that came up with that, the consensus on that. And it will provide all of these benefits to the city moving forward. A system that sends the right resource to the right call, more effective, more efficient than it would otherwise. So that's everything that's happened up to date. What needs to happen now? Well, the first thing really, frankly, that has to happen is 911 has to have kind of some rework in order to fully, capture this. Dr. Jackson and I spent for about 2 seconds in the hallway, but I know in other conversations, you need 911. If you have a high-performing 911 system, you can do it. So we are currently working with the manager. We sat there and are collecting additional data from the 911 center because they have to understand everything. They have to be properly staffed for this. We don't know where that is. We've got the data. We just still going back and forth on a little bit. But to analyze the full workload in the center, which includes law enforcement, make sure they have the proper people every hour of the day to do the work that needs to be done, specify those requirements, identify the process changes that have to occur to implement these new protocols, and then to support that implementation. And when that happens, you will restore some capacity back into the system. And what we've recommended to the manager already is you kind of need to let that sit for a while and then see how the system's performing, make sure it's meeting the expectations. We've done this all over the country. We're very confident in meeting the numbers, but I think the folks that work in your system, the 911 center, everybody needs to have that confidence to let the system kind of restabilize after that significant change in the deployment plan. And then you'll be able to analyze, confirm that you're meeting the objectives that you want to meet. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions, or Dr. Knight will.
Mr. Manager, did you want to make any comments on this before we go to questions?
No, Mr. Mayor, thank you. I think at this point in time, if there are questions from Mr. Miller or Dr. Knight, we'd be happy to take those.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. Questions from the City Council? Councilmember Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I do have a few questions. I'm curious. I've got my notes here from when I actually didn't meet with you in person. I met with you over the phone back in November, on November 5th. And it appears to me from the notes that I took during that meeting that your recommendations have changed a bit from back in November. At that time, you said you were not recommending doing 6-minute modeling, and you also said you were not recommending that the city close any stations. And at that time, you were only recommending that we make improvements with the 911 dispatch system. So I'm wondering now why your recommendations have changed. What's happened between November and now?
Excuse me. So back in October and even November when we spoke with you, we didn't have any specific recommendations. What we had offered at that time, and you are correct, we talked about the opportunity, and I called it bookending, in the range of alternatives, the range of opportunities. It was to move the travel time requirement, which would, as I showed here, could allow you to go from a 5-minute to 6-minute, would allow you to do it from 6 stations instead of the 12. The other one was status quo, keep it exactly the same. We also talked about kind of a midpoint or a more balanced approach, is I think the term that was used, that you would be able to eliminate some units from the system because of the capacity that you had. And ultimately, and we didn't make a recommendation at that time. We recognized we were asked to provide some comment of what the data reflected at that time. And I'm aware the council did make a decision in the budgetary process to make some adjustments, not the 3, but to make some adjustments with regard to the budget. The second half, I'm sorry, you asked there was a second half about.
Oh, it was about the 6-minute modeling, the stations, and then it was my understanding you were recommending only that we make improvements with the dispatch system.
Well, so the dispatch system, but we had talked about that as well, that opportunity to go from about 3 minutes and 2 seconds to what we more typically see, about 1:45 to 2 minutes. And also employing the medical priority dispatch allows you to make the system more efficient with essentially, from the field perspective, no additional cost, because you're just not going to send the fire department on calls to which they don't need to go. The best practice is not to take low priority calls, and again, I'm just going to keep using it. There's a number of them, but that ground level fall without any head injury, without anything else, and to send 2 units to that is excessive, to be quite frank. So what you do is you look at what's the likelihood of that patient needing transport, et cetera, and you decide, is that one better for the fire department to go without lights and siren, or one better for AMT to go because the patient may more likely need transport. So that was always part of what we just hadn't gotten finished the full analysis on that. So, but again, we weren't making recommendations there. We have worked through that since that time. You know, again, we went through kind of some iterative review with the fire department on the data and what the modeling showed us, and focusing still on dispatch and the full deployment of medical priority dispatch in the 911 center.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions. When you say the best practice, do you do primarily analysis and consulting for municipalities that have both that do both fire and ambulance service, or are you dealing with municipalities like us that have fire and then private ambulance services?
I'll let Dr. Knight answer that because he's a partner in the firm and probably has a better.
Sure. Good evening. Sorry, God did not give me a good voice like Bruce. So, here's how I would answer really both of your questions. First, as a firm, we evaluate systems that do fire with only first response, fire with ALS first response, fire that does full EMS transport, public-private partnerships, third party, all across the spectrum, including health systems. We have a great deal of experience modeling systems, building systems, and managing systems. So we got a great deal of depth. When we say best practice for what you're trying to do today with the priority dispatch, it truly is. That you should be very complimentary and proud of the network of agencies that came together to move this forward in a collaborative manner. So I applaud that. Going back to your earlier question about the recommendations in 6 stations or 6 minutes or however, I just wanted to touch that briefly to build on what Bruce had shared or Dr. Mueller had shared on that. What we built was really our job is to make sure that we give you objective data for you to make policy decisions. So we balanced out what the potentiality of what you could do. But if you notice in our recommendations, we felt like going to half of your stations might be a little too far for a political body. Most bodies want to maintain or improve unless they're under considerable fiscal restrictions. So our recommendations really modeled down to about 3 units, and the board opted to go with 2. And then as you can see today, we still just presented the data, but the real recommendation is how do you reintroduce capacity back in the system from an efficiency standpoint, and that's what your medical priority dispatch can afford you. So downstream, let's just say, and I don't know what the exact growth number is for you, but let's just say you're going to continue to grow by 5, 6, 7% a year in call volume from the community. That 15% reduction will cost avoid your having to reintroduce resources into the system at some future date. So it really is a best practice, and it's a great framework for long-term sustainability.
Okay.
Okay, sure. So, sorry, I thought I did that. So in the fire practice, you know, all of the consultants that work for Fitch & Associates in the fire program had a career in the fire service. I retired as an assistant fire chief out of a metro-sized fire department. And we manage as a firm, or not manage, but do the consulting services as a firm with primarily cities and counties because they're the fire service providers. When we get into more pure EMS, we might vary off into the private sector or health systems. But in the fire program, it's mostly municipalities and counties across that, and we do some international work as well.
Okay. I got a couple more questions about the recommendation. If I heard you right at the end, is you're going to first work with 911 and reorganize it, and I don't know what your terms are, but that's going to take a while, and that you're going to have them start working after you've redeveloped it before any other changes are made. Is that what you're recommending, before we do anything else with regards to fire or law enforcement or anything else?
Yes, absolutely. And we're not contemplating anything with law enforcement from our lens. What the law enforcement piece is, we have to understand the totality of work that's being done in the dispatch center with all of the calls and intakes for the dispatchers. So that's why we're readdressing the data and capturing all the law enforcement data, because we have to model out the proper staffing and channels and consoles and everything in order to do the medical priority dispatch as we're describing. So I don't know the exact implementation time frame, but yes, that's the first. You have to conquer the communication center first and foremost, and then you're able to downstream the rest of the changes.
And then are you recommending any further closure of units or stations?
No, we're not recommending any of that. We're where you are today. I think you've already made your policy decision. That's in play. What this does is give you an equivalency of introducing capacity.
And that's simply by having not both the fire department and EMT go to those low priority calls.
Yes, and it's a great question. So it's somewhat complex. So there's really two levels. If you only consider the Peoria Fire Department, there's 15% of the calls that they won't go to some future date, whenever that's fully implemented. That's capacity that you're able to absorb that growth for several years. That's capacity for you to be able to respond to the more critical calls in a timely manner. That's capacity for whatever else the chief's administration has or the city has for the fire department to do. So there's an equivalency value to that downstream for you as an agency. The other piece of that is, as a system approach, when you include AMT as well as the fire department, what makes the most sense for the taxpayer, and that's the avenue that you're going. It's not best practice to send multiple units to low acuity calls. It's not best practice to send multiple units that arrive very close to each other on low acuity calls. So you really have an opportunity to have a multi-pronged approach, if you will, on how to introduce efficiency into the system long term.
One thing I question, I can't remember what it is, but I think you said AMT gets there on average like 1 minute and 46 seconds after the fire department. Yes. And then you said, but so they arrive at the same time. They don't arrive at the same time, right?
Correct. There's 1 minute 49 on the timestamps in the CAD. From a practical, operational perspective, for the fire department to get there and have 1 minute and 49 seconds to approach the patient and begin, except in the highest priority cases, they're not really able to practice their skill set. They're not going to, there's tremendous things that have to occur in a critical patient, but now the ambulance crew's coming in right behind them with the same skill set that's going to transfer. So there just isn't, you actually look for about a 5-minute difference between that.
And I guess my question is another question. if we were to implement this and change and not have the fire department go to the low priority calls, doesn't AEMT have a longer period of time to, since what is it, 70% of the time the Peoria Fire Department gets there before AMT?
Yes, so this goes back to that piece, but we're talking about only those lowest priority calls where that time difference of a couple minutes isn't going to impact the clinical outcome, one. Two, working with 911, we're going to improve the time call processing there. So what I called the hello to hello time, you're actually very close to it. And if I could just go back, I know Dr. Knight answered it. You asked about questions to the fire department. In fact, I want to go just a bit further. We specifically, the council made a decision in this budget cycle with regard to adjustments in the fire department. The changes we're talking about in 911 and putting into place a new deployment plan, we would specifically, we've said it to the manager already, you specifically want to do that and let the system stabilize for a period of time. We would not recommend multiple. Yeah, you would not want to do 2, 3 things at the same time. In public safety, you carefully, thoughtfully make a change, implement it, make sure it's working, evaluate it. Then if you want to consider something else, that's a separate discussion. So I will specifically say we would not recommend doing that.
Okay. Does your recommendations with the changes, improvements to the dispatch center, will they require a new dispatch center or a new building?
We are actually anticipating that the 911 board, the ETSB, is going to be funding some improvements to the 911 center this year. There's some funds that they had identified to be set aside to redo the 911 center, moving it in the municipal services building from the 2nd floor down to the 1st floor. So that will allow us to address some of the space issues that we have within the 911 center.
But not building a new center, keeping it where it's at.
It's building a new room where every dispatcher will operate from, but not moving out of the facility that they're in. They'll move down from the 2nd floor to the 1st floor.
And just to be clear how we're approaching that, again, I mentioned law and I should have been clear. Since the center handles law enforcement, fire, EMS, you have to understand the entire workload there, hour by hour. That's what we're doing, hour by hour, by position. The person answering the phones, the person on this radio channel, the person on this radio channel. We will model that entire thing and then hour by hour understand how many personnel are needed in what role. And again, there's nothing that indicates a significant change to the infrastructure on that, but it may be an additional seat that needs to be covered 24 hours a day or partial day or whatever. We're going to have to, that's what we're in the process of understanding now.
This is sort of a side question, but we've always had, it's always been difficult to hire dispatchers and retain them and keep them, and I understand that's a problem across the country. So, we don't have that much control or impact on that, and does that have some part of the impact on why we're, I guess, short and not as good as we could be with our dispatch system?
It's possible. And until we get that data back, we really have to dig into that a little bit more, understanding what the demand was hour by hour and what the staffing was. Any center, and I will tell you, about 17 to 24%, 25% turnover per year is not unusual in 911 dispatch centers, and it's very challenging for any entity that tries to run one. But it may very well be, but until, again, the analytics are done, we wouldn't have a good sense of that.
Okay. Thank you.
I have Councilmember Akeson next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I just have a few clarification type questions, and then I'd like to bring some of this information to the attention of anyone listening because it could have been missed. So can you turn to slide 13 or page 13? Right. So the labels, dispatch interval, can you just describe what that means?
Sure. So there's 3 components, and when we calculate, we look at those 3 components. The dispatch interval is from the time the phone hits the 911 center, depending on the system, generally it's when they answer the phone, hello, until the time that they alert the vehicles that have to go. Most systems use some sort of alerting system, and again, we'll talk about the fire station. When they set the tones off, the computer system captures that time. The next interval,
I'm going to have some questions after each description. So what's the ideal dispatch interval? What is considered to be what you want to aim for?
So I'll tell you what the most conventional thinking is, the recommendation. So the National Fire Protection Association has a standard 1221 in their 2016 edition. They said for a fire call, it should be 60 seconds to process the call, 90 out of 100 times.
1 minute?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so so I'm going to call that T1.
Yeah, but if you're doing emergency medical dispatch, then that standard, the 2016 edition, gave you 90 seconds to do it.
30 seconds.
1 minute,
okay.
30 seconds.
Okay. So then.
On the type of call. There is no recommendation for law enforcement.
Okay. So then for the turnout interval, can you describe that?
Sure. So the turnout interval, similar. If it is a non-fire call, you're not having to put on all the bunker gear, it's 60 seconds, 1 minute. And if you do put on the bunker gear, it's 80 seconds. 1 minute and 20 seconds. Because again, and yeah, I'm sorry, so that's NFPA. The accreditation, Commission on Fire accreditation, gives you 90 seconds for that. And that's because the crews have to go down and don all the gear. You don't want them standing up on the truck trying to put that on, so they give you more time on a fire call.
Okay, so in previous discussions, the Councilman Graham has mentioned the matrix study, and I hadn't really had a chance to read it, but in conversations with Councilman Sear, he really urged me to get a copy and read it. And it's interesting, on page 13 of the matrix study, it addresses these issues of dispatch interval, and they call it reflex time rather than turnout interval. And the recommendations or the concerns in 2004 are the same concerns you're alerting us to now, right? Because our 90%, and you said in the presentation, don't get wrapped up in the 90th percentile. Just when you're discussing this with the public, just keep it at the 50% mark.
Well, it's easier from a public discourse averages rather than 90th percentiles, yes, but.
But just like when you get on an airplane, you really want it to be, as close to 100% as possible. So we have some room for improvement in those two components that seem to be within our control, right?
Generally, dispatch time and turnout intervals are within management control. Travel time, less so. But I want to just add one other piece.
I'm not travel. I'm just talking about this.
Those generally in management control.
Okay. Yes. What I'm getting to here is, in 2004, these were brought to our or not to our attention because no one here on the council was serving at that time, with perhaps Mayor Artis, Councilman Graham, and perhaps Councilman Turner. So the recommendations 15 years ago were to address those two considerations. There was a lot of emphasis put on that in the matrix study, and yet we're still there today. So is there any way to kind of unwrap or figure out what's holding us back from being able to achieve those two numbers?
So let me try to address it this way, and I'll talk in generalities. When it comes to the dispatch center specifically, we're in the middle of evaluating that. So we may be able to uncover, whether it's a staffing issue, whether it's a technology issue, but we'll be able to start to uncover and unpack a little bit about what's contributing to that. When it comes to turnout time, there's several things that could be influencing that. If the layout of the stations are poor and it's very difficult to get from point A to point B, that could impact that. Generally, that's less so overall. Sometimes it's just behavioral. If the company officers aren't necessarily making that a priority, it's not on everyone's mind, Everybody's moving at the same speed. It's not purposeful or intensive. But what most agencies have done is some simple technology tricks where they'll put a clock up in front of the engine by the bay doors, so that when the bells go off,
audience can hear.
Yes, sorry, yep. So what they'll do is they'll have a clock next to the bay door, so it starts when they're dispatched. They'll come downstairs, and as the door's going up and they're getting dressed and getting on the truck, everybody's aware. Generally, that awareness program is enough to start moving the pendulum. Certainly, the fire chief and the administration starting to address that is typically enough to get it moving in the right direction, and then you monitor it and you report and it's generally usually quite correctable.
May I keep going? Okay. So then if you could go to page 18 and 19, or slide 18 and 19. Okay, so unfortunately my name and the time I have to talk, although Councilman Jensen, the clock didn't start for hers. So do I have a little bit more than 5 minutes?
I stopped hers when she stopped talking, and I do the same thing for you.
Oh, you did? Okay. Oh, all right. Well.
But you can have more time.
Okay. So unfortunately, my name is kind of blocking this, but there's a hyperlink there, and I would like the city manager to put that document, it's an 18-page read, on the city's website for the citizens to read this. I think it's probably, when you reviewed your preliminary review with the council members in October, this particular information was the most profound takeaway for me. And maybe, without going into, a lot of detail, but when the term legacy is used, that would be the way fires were fought, and time to make a dramatic difference in the outcome of a fire has shrunk from, is it 30 minutes down to 5?
About 20 to under 4, yes.
Oh, say that again.
About 20 minutes to under 4.
Right. So from the time that somebody says, my house is on fire, to the time that they call the fire station or call 911, there may be some gap there, right? There may be some time, like, oh my God, I think I smell fire. The dispatch time and the reflex time, or the time to respond, or what is it called? What is the category again? Turnout. That is using up that window of time before the newer homes will reach a flash point, right? Flashover.
Yes. But I do have to qualify that there's a lot of variables that go into that, whether or not it has access to oxygen, what the fuel load is. I mean, there's a lot of things, but in a general sense, you're absolutely right.
Which is why I'm bringing it up, and which is why I'd like to have the city manager put that document on the city's website, so anyone who's interested in this can get a better understanding about how this is, why this has come to be. And it has a lot to do with the construction materials and the size of homes today, and et cetera, et cetera. So our focus on the time of response in some sections of the city, it may be, we may not be able to have that much impact, right?
Yes, and that's true for nearly universally every fire department in the United States.
Right.
That's a very difficult challenge.
Right. So I just think from a expectation standpoint, our citizens need to really read that and really understand it, and it will make having future discussions, I think, easier. And then on page, can you go to 19? Right, okay. So can you explain this slide a little bit more for...
Sure. So I'll draw your attention to the graphic. That's probably a little easier. What that shows, and that stems back to the late 70s, actually, but it's really the time to defibrillation for cardiac arrests. So what this is suggesting is, in the research that was back then, is the closer to the time that your cardiac arrest was recognized to defibrillation, the better the survival. So you can see it's a descending line if you pay attention to that. If you're under 1 minute, if it's a witnessed cardiac arrest right in front of a paramedic with a defibrillator or somebody with an AED, that's why that's so powerful in addressing that public health need. It's a 90% success rate. But every minute longer that it takes before you can provide that level of intervention, it elongates all the way out. So you can see at 9 minutes, it's close to 10 to 0% overall. Now, there's a lot of, it's important, and I appreciate you wanting that link up there, because it's important to understand there's always underlying context to these things. And this really requires that the cardiac arrest was witnessed, that it's a shockable rhythm, that bystander CPR was there. There's a lot of things that go into it. But in a general sense, all it's really showing is time is important on those highly critical events.
Okay, so I remember that when you gave us this information, that I thought educating the public would be a very important task for the city to engage in. And I'm hoping that the city manager does have a plan for communicating why all this information is super important. And then beyond that, I think having focused some attention on those two variables that seem to be quick wins, and that will reduce the time so that when you add the travel time, and then the other component, what's the fourth component after the travel? It's
that was just the cumulative. That's a total response time. That's all in. Yep.
Right. Mm-hmm. So then you just that's the benefit, right?
Absolutely. And as Dr. Moeller mentioned, your return on investment in the communication center is exponential to trying to purchase that level of improvement in the field. So by buying more stations or buying more units, it's the better investment from you from a fiscal perspective. And the turnout time specifically is usually a no cost option to fix.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. I had Councilmember Euler next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The presentation focused highly on the difference between the medical calls versus the medical response versus fire response. But I didn't really see in there a discussion on number of resources that are deployed from one department or the other, like the fact that 1, 2, 3 plus fire apparatuses showing up at an event. Like to understand is, are we deploying the right number of resources from the one specific department as well?
I remember where my ERF was. Here we go. So this was the question actually that the fire chief asked. Is, again, we talk about response time, it's kind of the first unit on scene. I think if I understand your question correctly, this deals with something we refer to as effective response force, and it's to assemble 15 firefighters on scene. This is based off of NFPA 1710 for a single family home. How quickly can I get 15 firefighters on scene? NFPA 1710 recommends 8 minutes for that, while the commission, depending on whether it's an urban, suburban, or rural environment, goes 10, 12, 14. So this is the amount of time that you can make it. Let's look at the first one. 8 minutes today, the way the system was configured, you were meeting at 32% of the time. And under option 2, which is what the council chief, option 2 is what was done? Option 2, the 2 rescues? Yeah. So it's 28.62. That's pretty minimal difference. And then the 10 minutes. So that's the amount of time it takes for multiple units, multiple fire apparatus to arrive on scene in order to get 15 personnel ready to handle that incident. Does that answer your question?
Question is more along the lines of, especially when it's not a structure fire, are you analyzing whether we sent the appropriate number of vehicles on these calls? If it's a medical call and 3 engines show up, is that the most effective use of resources? Are you analyzing that data to understand how many units went out and if that was the right use of those units?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know off the top of my hand what's in that, but that is in the data report. But specifically, the effort from the group on the medical priority dispatch, when it comes to medical calls specifically, that's one of the intents, is to make sure it matches the right resource to the right level of risk. And right now, all fire departments going, AMTs going, and there's cost centers from both events. So separating out where it's reasonable to do so, where the AMT could go alone, or the fire department goes alone, or everybody goes together on the really serious calls, that's where you start to make sure that you really align the number of resources that are allocated, as well as Dr. Moeller mentioned, your risk management piece of whether or not they need to go emergency or not and go through red lights or not in a different manner. So it really provides that flexibility and starts to right-size some of that modeling.
So that's all data we will see at a future point in time?
Yes, yeah, it's in the data material that I've already put together, as well as part of the intent and design of the medical priority dispatch.
Next question is, one of the things that we talk a lot about, especially when it comes budget time, is overtime. Are you analyzing our use of overtime and whether or not we are effectively managing that?
No. No, we didn't do a staffing analysis on that specifically.
Okay. One of your answers to Councilwoman Jensen's question was regarding the fact that we already made a policy decision. What policy decision are you referring to?
Taking the 2 rescues out of the service, or the 2 units?
I'm not sure, that that's our overall writing policy decision here. And in my assessment, that's why we hired you, was to tell us if we have more opportunities to gain or we need to go a different direction. So we made a decision at the time that was based on the set of circumstances that were in front of us, but I by no means would say that that was the policy decision that guides the direction that we're going.
Yeah, Councilman, I made that reference. So one of my former lives, I was a city manager. So generally, obviously, the ultimate expression of policy of a legislative body is the budget. So if that was inartful, then I apologize for that. What we said in our earlier work when we were here in October is there was a range of options, and kind of that central part we talked about was the ability for 3 units likely would not have an impact. The council ultimately in the budget made an adjustment of 2 units. With regard to future things, my response to I go back and forth, sorry. Councilman Jensen, or Councilwoman Jensen, had to do with we would not recommend any additional changes in the near future. You need to implement the efficiencies and the best practices of MPDS. Let that sit for 6 months to a year, reanalyze the data, and then your question is there another opportunity? The data at that time will tell you, but you've reduced 2 units right now. We're talking about the changes with the deployment plan for medical. I would suggest that that's a fair amount of change in the system, and you would want to relook at the data at that time before determining whether there's other opportunities or not.
So what do you estimate as a standard stabilization period?
6 months to a year of data after implementation of all the changes.
And a couple of times throughout the discussion here, you've mentioned that you're not telling us to make reductions, or you're not telling us to make certain decisions. That's what we, in my opinion, hired you to do, is to tell us the things that, in your professional opinion, you see that need to be done. And so I want to ensure, at least from my perspective, that that's extremely clear. I am looking for those suggestions, not just in this presentation, but the rest of the data that's coming. Is I want to know what those suggestions are, regardless if we're too heavy, we're too light, where things should be. Those are the types of things that we need to understand.
And so the way we attempt to do that, and I'll ask Dr. Knight then to weigh in, is we frame it as kind of a structure of policy analysis. Because ultimately, and I will be very clear on this. We are consultants. The decisions rest with the council. Whether you want to get there faster, slower, whether there was a graphic when we met prior where we talked about risk versus cost, right? So that's, that risk versus cost. We want to, and what we strive to do, is to give you a framework under which to do that analysis and to answer the questions when you say, well, what if we went here, what is the likely input? So it's somewhat of an iterative function, so if we need to work a little harder at that, we're happy to do that.
And my last question is, when do you expect the current portion of the study to come to a close, wrapping the dispatch part up and giving us these final assessments?
So I've chatted with the manager on that. So the report up to, on those earlier slides, except for the dispatch, and I'll come back to that in a second, except for the full evaluation of the dispatch, within the next 2 weeks we'll have the report delivered, which will have this PowerPoint, the executive summary, the data report, the GIS report, and the work done by the medical group of AMT Fire Department Medical Director. We've been going back and forth with 911 on the data. There was actually some emails today between our data analyst and 911. Generally, once we get the data, it takes us about 6 weeks for him to finish the analytics on that, and then we're able then from that to start building the staffing analysis. So I'm going to guess that's going to be another 2.5 months, 3 months on the outside before we would have that part. We'll be communicating with the manager if we can speed that up a little bit. But that the analysis is every single radio position, every single seat of a telephone, we analyze by hour of day and what's the requirements to handle that workload. So there's a significant amount of math that goes into that.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Councilmember Sear next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Miller and Dr. Knight, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. First question is really for City Manager. What is our purpose tonight of this presentation? Just start the discussion?
The purpose of this was to present the information to date, to share this information with you, to talk about some of the key findings that were made, to report back on the efforts of AMT and the Fire Department and the Project Medical Director to date, and to provide that information to you. There had been a request that we get this information to you by the end of this month, and that's what we were trying to do.
Thank you. I do have many concerns, and I'm just going to ask a few questions. I got about 20 questions here, but I'll probably just ask a few if we'll have more discussion later on. First question would be if any of the standards have changed since 2004.
Yes, I would suggest that they have migrated back and forth. I don't know that I could give you
some of the comments from my colleague, Ms. Akeson. I mean, we have this report that was done 15 years ago called the Matrix Report that I've read cover to cover. So it talks about a lot of standard, and in this report they make at least 30 recommendations that I'm sorry to say that most of them never been followed. And the first one took about 5 years to be implemented. So I'm very concerned about, especially what she said tonight, because like I said, I read this. I'm the councilman for the 5th District. I don't know if you're from Peoria, you know Peoria, but 5th District is the largest territory we have in the city of Peoria. And response time is what I'm concerned about. Number one, I mean, I'm not going to bore you. She covered number one already. I want to talk about number 3, if my computer comes back on. The travel interval. Nowhere in your presentation talks about, number 1, signal preemption. Okay, in this report here, it talks about they made the recommendation in 2004 that which should install at least 175 signals preemption. And we're at 15 years later, we're doing a few every year, but we're up to 50 right now. So in my district, travel time, you just said number 1 or 3, which number 1 was dispatch, number 3 is travel time. Very, very concerned about travel time in the 5th District. Matter of fact, a lot of numbers everywhere show that the travel time in the 5th District is the slowest, someplace of at least 2 minutes. And when we talk about a flashover of 5 minutes or less now, I'm very, very concerned about these numbers. Okay, and in 2004, they were talking about adding a fire station in the 5th District. Okay, and I know exactly where it should be, But I want you to talk to me about, and just to answer Ms. Akeson's question, I think, my personal opinion, every 2 years the fabric of this horseshoe has been changed, and that's one of the reasons why these recommendations are not, in my opinion, are not implemented. It takes years to do it, and also obviously money. But we need to prioritize, I think, what needs to be done. You said, right now, you said that, number one, dispatch interval. No, I didn't see dollar amounts anywhere, but I'm sure it's a combination of people and technology. How much money are we talking about to get our dispatch center to 1 minute or less, which is the goal, my understanding, correct?
Yes, you won't be able to answer that until we get back the data analysis of the dispatch center that we're currently in. Once we have that, we use a queuing theory mathematics to go through and actually figure out exactly how many lines you need, how many people you need, how many consoles you need, and then we'll be able to back into any cost adjustments from status quo.
Am I on the right track with this report, talking about saving per intersection? About 9 to 15 seconds. I mean, so a fire truck has to go through 6 of them. I mean, that's additional 90 seconds. So are we talking about, am I understanding these numbers correctly, I guess?
Well, I didn't review the matrix report, but I'll just talk about it more globally. Those kind of preemption systems are costly, and if that's the level of investment that you'd like to choose to get that marginal improvement, then I would encourage you to do so. What we're trying to explain here, and some of the direction with the medical party dispatch, et cetera, is it's in some aspects de-emphasizing your tolerance for response time. Now, that's not to say in the house fire or the cardiac arrest you don't need to be there extremely quickly. You do. You need to be there as fast as you can, exactly to your point. But the other 85 to 90% of the calls, you have to reevaluate how you're going to accomplish that. And will those investments get you the return on investment that you're looking for the outcomes? And what's your balance for risk tolerance and your fiscal capacity? That's really the policy question that's embedded in that. In our GIS report, for example, we modeled, to your point, about best practices. So if the board wanted to consider an NFPA 1710, for example, and improve time, we have an analysis in there that shows you if you wanted to move the pendulum forward and be faster, this is what it would look like. We also gave you some information, if you took the foot off the gas pedal, what capacity and opportunity did that have? So much like your question earlier, from our perspective, what we have to do is answer the questions in an objective, unbiased manner and say, this is the data, these are the pros and cons and adjustments to the system that would occur if you entertain any of these alternatives. What we can't answer for you, and only you can answer for you, is what's your risk tolerance for your community and what's your fiscal capacity, whether it's capability or desire. That balance is where you have to kind of pick up the baton, and we can do the analysis and say, this is what's going to happen if you entertain that, this is what you can expect if you don't. So where you want to set the mark for things like travel time, that's entirely up to you.
So when I hear risk tolerance, Dr. Knight, I'm thinking lives before buildings. I'm thinking about goals. And I think number one goal for the city of Peoria should be to save lives, especially in the 5th District. As I said, if travel time is going to be 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes more than anywhere else in the city, I want to make sure, not 90% of the time, but I want to make sure our system save people 100% of the time, especially in the city of Peoria. So I just want to say, next time we get together, I'm very concerned about travel time and where we should prioritize our dollar, okay? And making the travel time and the dispatch time, both of them, I'd like to know exactly and have some recommendations. Because like I said, last time in 2004, we received 30 recommendations. So I'm looking forward to getting some recommendations to how to save lives and be efficient in the city of Peoria. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I had Councilmember Riggenbach next.
Mr. Mayor, great information and great discussion around the horseshoe here this evening. I think there's been a number of questions that I had jotted down that I won't repeat, but there's a couple things that I put stars by that I just want to make sure that the listening public is aware of, because clearly this is a discussion that is just beginning tonight. And as we talk about this every budget cycle, talking about the EMS versus the fire, and why do we send a 90,000-pound fire truck when somebody falls? And, you know, the public has those questions like Councilman Euler was bringing up. So the medical priority dispatch, I think you probably didn't do this intentionally, but saving the dispatch center for last is probably where the most realistic opportunities are for us to grab hold of this and run, at least from my perspective. So the medical priority dispatch, I think, is going to be something that I really want to be able to wrap my arms around and see how that plays in the real world. The risk tolerance is something that, again, that Councilwoman Eggleston's analogy to the airplane, I think, is very apt. But we also know in life there are certain risks that are acceptable to us and certain that aren't. So that'll be something that 11 of us will have to conclude. But I think the number one thing that I heard tonight is getting the right resource to the right call. And that's the part that is going to make this sustainable, which is ultimately the long-term goal of what we're doing here, is making this city safe and sustainable for all of our families and businesses here. But getting the right resource to the right call is something that, again, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to really put our arms around it without the dispatch piece of it. But I think that's going to be what sets the dialogue from my perspective going forward. So I'll cut it short here, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. I had Councilman Grabe next.
And I thank you for coming to Peoria to help us make some decisions. We have a history of hiring consultants, and sometimes we pay attention to what they recommend, and sometimes we don't. And back in the mid-90s, when I was first seated around this horseshoe, we were going to take a vote about taking over the ambulance service in this community so we wouldn't have redundancy. Well, that was pulled from the agenda because suddenly there did not appear to be 6 votes to put PFD on the ambulances. So we've been living with this dual system now for many years. And AMT does a terrific job, and so does our Peoria Fire Department. And as good as our emergency dispatchers are, they don't always know what's really happening on the other end of that phone. So when it's one of my loved ones who might be needing care, I don't mind the redundancy if the fire department gets there 90 seconds or maybe more before AMT. Because I know that he or she will be in very, very good care either way. And I appreciate your peer. Matter of fact, appreciate it so much that I'm almost ready to offer you as I can, because you appear to be getting the same thing I am. But you did use a very important concept that the council has to entertain, and that's what is our risk tolerance? Seriously, and that is what it comes down to. And back, I go from the mid-90s when we were talking about putting Peoria Fire Department on the ambulances to then 2004 when we commissioned the Matrix study. Gosh, when we got the Matrix study back, the primary impetus behind it was how can we save money? And I'll be switched if these consultants didn't come back and say, you need to spend more money the way you've been growing your city. And guess what? We didn't pay any attention to it. Hence the on-target comments by my fellow councilman, Denny Sear. We know the northwest part of the city is woefully underprotected. So these are very, very serious issues, and helping us navigate these waters, I think, is important. But ultimately, the elected leaders have to be able to justify taking down a firehouse, decommissioning a couple of rescue squads. And I know when I go to my neighborhood meetings and meet with citizens, I have to be able to feel good about what we're doing. I had a very good friend and colleague, didn't always agree with him, but he sat where Beth Jensen sits right now. His name was Gary Sandberg. And he said the primary responsibility of our city, and the number one thing that should animate us when we pass a budget, is core basic services. And police and fire rescue are core basic services. It involves life and death decision making. And the budgets that we pass may very well impact whether someone lives or dies. If it were always so easy to know when somebody falls here that they just have a very minor contusion, that's what's going to be determined after the x-rays, it'd be one thing. But when that person answers 911, what is your emergency? It is quite often very, very muddled. And I think our community appreciates the fine job done by AMT, fine job done by our Peoria Fire Department, and I think for the most part we don't feel we have too many firehouses. And we're not too happy with the retirement of both fire rescue squads. So, we get all this information about how much resources do other communities, given their populations, put out there to service their communities. We take a look at Springfield, we take a look at Naperville, we took a look at this, take a look at that. But ultimately, those are nice things to read, but I am not a councilman for Naperville. I was elected to be a councilman for the city of Peoria. And I was elected to do what my constituents think is best for their safety and security. Boy, what a surprise that was in 2004 when these people we hired come back and say, with these gross cells, you need to consider spending more money on firehouses. When the whole impetus on the part of the power structure in this city then was, how can we save money? Thank you very much. And thank you for the concept of risk tolerance.
I had Councilmember Ruckriegel next.
Thank you. Thank you for a thorough presentation. I've got to be honest, I wrote down a lot of questions, and I've crossed most of them off because we've had some great questions from the rest of the council. But a couple of things I think here that are just, if we can touch base, and they're going to be kind of across the board because there are a couple leftover sort of items. And I keep drawing an eye to this matrix study because that was 15 years ago. And I'm thinking about, I guess, a comment here that if we would have put into place, it wasn't probably about just saving money. It was probably about giving better service because it could have shortened time and actually gotten vehicles to locations quicker. I think that's why you probably shortened that time from the call center. But I also think about the change that happened in 2008, which is the first iPhone coming out. So how does cell service, and I guess it may work in both ways, because if I am seeing an accident on the highway, everybody who passes may be calling for help, whether it's needed or not. Might be needed, but you might have multiple calls coming in. Or now I may take my cell phone to a house fire next door, and I can actually give information if somebody's trapped inside, if everybody's out. And how does cell service today affect the overall dispatch center?
Sure. So I'll try to answer that in a couple ways because there's some also new technology that's coming out now as well. So if we turn the clock back 20 years, when a citizen would call 911, it was a hard line, right? if I guess 20 years right. But that hard line, you would get an anti-alley dip into the dispatch center, and it would populate the address and everything immediately. What's changed today is, in most communication centers, 75% of the incoming calls are cellular calls. And it takes a lot longer to figure out what the true address is for the call because it's not immediately populated like it was with a hard line, with a landline. So that's the first major impact. The other aspect to that is, for your example, on the interstate or on a roadway, you may get 15, 20, 25, 30 calls that the comm center has to accommodate from the intake side because everybody's calling 911 to make sure that somebody's notified, where 20 years ago, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 houses might notify you that there's a problem in the neighborhood. So that's a significant impact. What's changing in the future with technology that's starting to come out now is Apple is introducing the GIS capabilities, much like you would for an Uber or a Lyft app, where they can immediately start to tell your location. They're the first company to start to do that. So there's technology pieces coming as well as text to 911, but I think your real question is, it impacts the intake side of the dispatch center and elongates the time to find what the true address is.
So the recommendations that you're making on time frame from, I guess, now, which it's actually interesting to have 2 different companies come out with a lot of the same recommendations. And I think it was good reading for any of us to re-review the Matrix study. Those timeframes can still be met, though. We may have new technology coming in, but they can still be met. Question, I guess, on the 121 categories and then going to 1,326 and the alphas and bravos. And I think a lot of times the public might think that AMT and the fire department are at odds. But I think you said that they were all in the room for the meetings and they helped together sort of maybe talk about that next step forward. Can you talk about those meetings? Frequency, how long? Because I think that that's good for the public to know that in terms of public safety, those 2 separate entities came together on this.
So I wish Mr. Fuentes was here because he's the one that facilitated it. The group involved the fire department, deputy chief, battalion chief of EMS, 2 senior managers from AMT, and the medical director. The work that was done, taking the 1,326 MPDS codes, determinants, subdeterminants, et cetera, and condensing it down into 121, or from 121 to that, and then into 14 different response protocols, was their work. It was their understanding of your system, their experience in the system, with a guided discussion on what the literature says. That was a joint effort because there has to be a high degree of trust, because what you're saying is on some calls we won't go, in the case of the fire department, so AMT is going to go. But again, they also recognize, the fire department says, but we're going to focus on the high priority calls where we can have a better opportunity to make a difference. We're going to focus on those, recognizing, obviously, then the AMT will come in behind them. So it was a very collaborative process. From everything I know, the information was shared with the team members last week, late last week and stuff. They've reviewed that. We'll include the entire process, the entire analysis in the full report when we deliver that in about 2.5, 3 weeks.
Great. And I think for Councilman Euler's question before, and I think he was talking about the switch with the policy change that, as you phrased it, that was made back recently with the fire department. Can you go to slide 26 and I guess you talked a little bit about, I guess, what that did to service time. Is it, if you're looking at it, and I know this is a data point, it's more numbers than it is but is it statistically significant what we're seeing the difference there? And that would be, I think it was slide 26.
Well, so 26 talks about the difference with the loss of the 2 rescues. The assembly of an effective response force for a structure fire is essentially unchanged between current ERF, effective response force, and option 2. So, I mean, you can look at the numbers based on the various time frames. It's essentially unchanged. It was somewhat similar on a single unit level when we look at this analysis too. the difference of 2 units on average changes response time 16 seconds. But when you calculate that statistically with a standard deviation, it's not statistically significant.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think my last question is just for the city manager. City manager, earlier we got some information, I think, sent out to the whole council. I think it was some comparisons that, I don't know if it filtered through you, if it filtered through the fire department, but there were some city comparisons and some numbers and things. And I guess one thing stood out, and I just have a question, I guess, on this. If I look at Aurora and Peoria, Illinois, in the numbers that were provided to us, and I think it might have come through Ryan Brady, through you, or wherever, I'm not for sure. I'm seeing Peoria has 196 individuals in the fire department. Aurora is 201. We're about 5 square miles difference. But I'm seeing Aurora at $48,500,000 that they're putting in as their salaries, their full salaries for Aurora, and I'm seeing us at $20,500,000. Are we comparing apples to apples there? I mean, or is there something that we are just so efficient that those, because that's 5 people difference, and that's $20 million that doesn't seem to be attributed there, if we're talking about light costs in some way.
I think that there was some comparative data that was pulled together that didn't include our pension costs, our benefit costs, some of the capital costs that are rolled up in some of the other reporting that other departments do as they present that information. In order to do a true comparison of apples to apples, you've got to roll up all of those costs in there to be able to account for that. So,
some of the fill-in costs of being able to pull people in, or overtime costs, that might not be in there?
The overtime costs should be included in that. What it's really is, the way we account for, we don't account within the fire department's general fund budget for the cost of pensions, nor do we account for the cost of workers' comp and liability insurance or any of those costs we're carrying on that front. So
I'm going to ask for you to do something. When we get numbers, I'm going to assume that they are apples to apples. If
correct.
They're not, they're not. Can you maybe update that chart for us? And I understand it was last minute to be able to get it to us, but can you update it so we have?
Well, it didn't come from us, but yes, we'll be happy to pull that information and talk to the other departments and get an apples to apples comparison.
I mean, if we're using that for some of our data points, I think that we might be off on some numbers there. Sure. That'd be great. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Montalongo next.
Thank you, Mayor. Just have a few questions. First of all, thank you for being here tonight. As far as dates go for gathering data, maybe that was covered, but what are the dates that the data was gathered from, starting from what date to what date?
For the data that I reported?
Yes.
So it was 5 years of data ending in calendar year 2017. Most of what you saw here was 2017 data, a full year. We generally do the 5 years because we're looking for trends. We're trying to see if there's a significant increase in structure fires or a dramatic drop in automobile accidents. That is reported in the full data report, nothing particularly noteworthy. So 2017 data is what you're looking at here.
Okay. Another question I had was, as far as the data that's gathered, you mentioned our 911 system that we have that collects data probably on our fire department.
So we used CAD data, which comes from the 911 center, and we don't want reports. We always ask them, they've got all sorts of canned reports they can push out. We don't want that because we don't know what the programmer did when he did the report. We go in, extract the raw data, pull it out, and utilize that. The fire department, just in the data they did, and it's very typical because they've got access to the record system. It also shows them, the 911 center sends you to what they were told. It's a structure fire. They may get there and it's not a structure fire. It's a pot on the stove, or it's a light ballast that burned out. So the way the fire department generally, almost all of them use the records that they find once they arrive on scene. So that's some of the reason for the difference.
Gotcha. So 911 is probably more electronic data that's there. Fire department might be manually input.
So the CAD data is captured by the computer dispatch system by the dispatchers live as it happens. The firefighters, that system then helps feed. I'm assuming it's feeding some of the basic information into your RMS, Chief. Yeah. So that some of that data is transferred into the fire department's records, but then the fire officers come back and have to pull up the report and say, okay, this is what it was, and they'll answer a series of questions about what they found. Manually put in, yes, sir.
What about AMT?
AMT, we used computer-aided dispatch data for them as well. And so what we did is we had to go back and link the records between the 911 centers, the city's 911 center, and AMTs. But in both cases, we used CAD data that was raw data extracted out of it.
Do they have similar reports like the fire department where somebody's...
The system, they have EPCR. They'll have what we call electronic patient care records. So that's, again, for the fire department. When they come back from a fire call, they fill out a report called NIFRs. So they report it up to the state. The medical calls have a patient care report. It's a patient record.
Yeah, I'm getting at the data that you're collecting, though, and measuring here.
We used CAD data.
So it's all CAD data.
All CAD data for us.
Nothing that's manually input by anybody.
It's captured by the CAD. It's captured by the computer dispatch system as the call's occurring.
Okay.
So there's so many times if the
on site and then when they leave,
all those timestamps occur. So when they get on the radio and say we're en route to the call, the dispatcher clicks it, or depending on the system, they have a mobile device in their computer in their vehicle and they push it. When they arrive on scene, the same thing, a timestamp. When they're done, timestamp.
Thank you for clearing that up for me. Sure. Also, you were, and this goes back to our early in your presentation, you were discussing possibly recommendations for fire department to increase from 5 to 6 minutes, perhaps. Was that one of the recommendations that?
No, so it wasn't a recommendation. What we were showing in that when we were here in October, and again tonight reflected it again, is the policy decision of whether you want to have a 4-minute response time or a 5-minute response time or a 6-minute response time, and the significant difference it can have in what's necessary. That goes back to the risk tolerance question that Dr. Knight was talking about.
You also mentioned AMT going from 8 minutes to 9 minutes in there.
So my understanding is contraction now, their franchise agreement is 9 minutes, 59 seconds, 10 minutes. And the recommendation is for those certain types of calls to let them go to 10 minutes and 59 seconds. So they would add 1 minute there on those calls, but at the same time, you would be reducing the call processing time in the 911 center. So,
okay. Maybe I need to probably study that a little bit more because that seems just a little bit counterintuitive to when we're talking about somebody needing care very quickly and.
So let me go. Yeah.
Trying to go through here, but still, it just seems counterintuitive to say most people want somebody there quickly when it's an emergency.
Yeah, and I'll ask Dr. Knight to weigh in if I don't hit the salient points. So in a good system design, there's really two components. You need somebody to get there fast. Let's talk about the serious calls. All right, we're talking about one where time makes a big difference. They're having trouble breathing. It's a drowning. It's a heart attack. There's really two components you have to address. You have to get somebody there quickly. Okay, but once you get somebody there quickly, they begin life-saving care on the scene. They begin to treat. There's a transport component. Your system uses the fire department as the first response component and AMT as the transport component. So on many calls, and I don't remember the data from here on many calls, Dr. Knight and I worked in a system like this. The fire department got there first, 85% of the time. And the ambulance component, the transport component, got there 2.5, 3 minutes later. The fire department has already begun the life-saving care. They're stabilizing the patient. They're treating the patient. Many times on scene of most medical calls, you're on scene 10, 15 minutes before you move the patient to the ambulance and take them to the hospital if you're going to transport the patient. So you design the system to ensure there's a fast first response, which in this case the fire department provides. They're well situated throughout the community. By pulling back from them going to the low priority calls, they have greater availability for the high priority calls. And then you're making a minor adjustment on the transport component because the system can tolerate that and it's a more efficient operation.
Okay. I'm going to try not to repeat some of the other points that my fellow colleagues have made as well, but One of the other important pieces to this is cost as well for us, and trying to determine those costs out. But I think the other part that goes along with the cost is revenues that are brought in as well to the city or to AMT, and would like to kind of see what those comparisons are with that too. Do you do studies like that as well?
On the revenue versus cost expenditure?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a business model component to ambulance services, but in this particular context, I don't know that you would really realize that in a meaningful way. And the reason I say that is all of the calls get an ambulance today, and all of the calls would continue tomorrow to get an ambulance. So from that business model perspective, there's no real change. It's only a change in the desired performance window from when they arrive. Now, there's a cost equivalency or a cost avoidance that you could consider from the city perspective of elongating the time before you reinvest in the fire department because of workload. And that's where that reduction of 15% of the calls could play off for you over time.
I just want to be able to compare cost and revenues as well in there with it. How much money does the city able to recuperate, I guess, from any of this here? Because this is an important piece to it all on how we make a business decision. And so everything's got to be on the table for us to be able to count. And this kind of goes with, some of the comments that Councilman Graham mentioned as well. This is almost part of duplication that's happening as well. Have you done any other studies where the city does both the transport and, it does the transport? And just to do the study with the city doing the transport, I guess, have you?
Yeah, absolutely. We've studied all manner of systems and their design. And the system design is not the predicate for the outcomes. It's really the care, the quality of the clinicians, the setup of the system from an overall perspective. So it can be highly successful as a third service. It can be highly successful as a public-private partnership. It can be highly successful as a fire-based system. So yes, we've evaluated all the above.
Good. And I have kind of the same concerns that my fellow colleague, Councilman Sear, had too, and I think that's kind of like with the density of residents, and the further you get out, the more they're further apart as far as homes are, and getting to, and concerns for travel time is really important for us too. So that's all my questions here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
I have Councilman Graham.
Mayor, just informational only, and we're not tuning you out. We're just augmenting some of the things you've been saying. Chief Olahai, maybe you could approach the bench here and answer a question or two. Some of the flashover comments that we've had tonight, Councilor Akeson touched on that. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, with the new legacy or the legacy construction compared to the new construction, flashover, it doesn't happen much more rapidly. One of the things I think gets lost in the flashover idea is that we're talking about a flashover of a room a lot of times, not the house. We pride ourselves on being able to keep the fire to the room of origin, which the quicker we get there, the better we are at that. The survivability, if we're able to keep the fire to a room of origin, statistics will tell you have like a 95% better chance of survival if we keep it in the room of origin. And right now, I think the city, with our own numbers, again, I'm just shooting off the top of my head from the slide presentation I gave you. Currently, we're able to do that about 78% of the time. So, again, you use those numbers 80% of the time. You have a 95, 96% better chance of survival in the city of Peoria, with the current response model that we have. So, yes, it's correct. And when you read the data that tells you, hey, flashover does occur quicker, there's no doubt. it gets a little misleading when there's a lot of other factors and a lot of variables in that, a room actually getting to flash over. The new houses are much tighter than the old houses, so that the fire becomes vent limited pretty quickly. It's not until we introduce oxygen to it a lot of times, or a police officer or somebody trying to rescue somebody will introduce oxygen to it, fire it back up again. And again, it's all based on the new construction, and so there's a lot of variables into it. But the plastics do burn much quicker, much hotter, those types of things.
So in other words, just because the home is new doesn't mean it doesn't have significant risk when there's a fire.
The nice thing about a new house is, like I said, they are very, very tight. And if we can get people, and again, the fire service is notorious for, running ourselves out of business. If we can get people to sleep with the door closed, the windows there, it will stay in that room a lot of times. There's better protection, until that room is opened and stuff like that. The room will become limited. The fire will darken down until we're able to arrive. So there's just a lot of variables to it. Like I said, our big thing and we look at is our ability to keep something to a room of origin as opposed to spreading to the house. And again, all that comes down to when was it discovered, how long did it take them to call it in, those types of things. So there's just a ton of variables to it.
Well, Chief, we've been talking about your department an awful lot, and if you would like to comment on any of the other things that we've touched on, this is your opportunity, I guess.
Oh, no, I think there's a lot of good information in the study. I think it, kind of like we have said, I think Mr. Mueller said it himself, depending on who's reading the data and what you're trying to get out of it, different things can be achieved through it. Like I said, we believe that there's some room for improvement with our response times with AMT, spreading that out to make it more feasible and more affordable for everybody, make it a better system in the city of Peoria. I think some of that data is in there. I think where the data misses out some is, we run our own times off of our data that we have. Response models done on a computer don't take into consideration the new speed humps we've put on Northmore that we have to slow almost to a stop to. They don't take in traffic, school crossings, crosswalks, all those types of things, we've found that the data doesn't support it quicker than the computer model has itself. And again, we just used our own numbers to run that. So, I think in the whole, there's some good things that can be achieved from this. But I also think, like I said, with the reduction of our, the 2 rescue squads that we've already done, where this data doesn't reflect that. We haven't even been able to look at that yet. We know that this has been a dispatch problem since 2000, the Matrix study since 2014, whenever it was done. That dispatch is not a fix overnight. To say we're going to gain a bunch of time just to the dispatch center, I think needs to be evaluated and needs to be seen. Like I said, until that situation comes around and they're done with that study, it's really hard for us to say.
Thank you, Mayor, for indulging me on a second round, and thank you, Chief.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more lights here, so I'll take that as an indication that we've gotten this round of questions answered. I know we have significant discussion left to go in this area. Mr. Manager, maybe you could just give the council a quick what the expectation is in the next step with, kind of as specific as we can of when we're going to expect to have those conversations.
So as the Mr. Mueller indicated, you'll be getting the full report of what's been done to date, which should be coming to you in the next couple of weeks. And then following that, after we wrap up the dispatch portion of that, we'll have the consultants back to give a full presentation at that point in time about what their findings are with regards to the dispatch center itself.
So full report in a couple weeks?
Full report in a couple weeks, yes.
And then
we'll have...
I'm trying to get specifics here because this has been
sure.
quite some time that we've been trying to get to a point where we can make some more decisions.
Within the next couple of weeks, it'll be the full report with the exception of the additional analysis we were asked to do on the 911. So we've had to do a fresh pull of data from 2018, which just includes law enforcement, everything else. That will follow. I think we've pretty much got the data nailed down, so the analyst, I've got to get with him. There was discussions today between him and the 911 center I'm anticipating 2.5, 3 months on the outside for that full report to be delivered.
So that'll put us mid-July.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We'll try to speed that up if we all can, but it really does depend on the data.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. This evening, we have a motion to receive and file this information by Councilman Sear and seconded by Councilman Graham. Please cast your ballots. The motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
We're at the first readings. 19-100 is a request to concur with a recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission and staff for a first reading of an ordinance amending Appendix A, the Unified Development Code, relating to handicap accessible parking.
Director Black.
Thank you, Mayor. This is a minor amendment to the city's ordinance that is based on a change that the state of Illinois made to the Illinois Accessibility Code. They updated it last year, and this just simply brings our local requirements for handicapped accessible parking into alignment with state requirements.
Okay. Any questions on this, Councilman Ruckriegel?
Thank you. Just one quick question. If a parking lot is in compliance with what we currently have on the ordinance or on the books, do they need to change over to this, or is it an either-or situation?
If a parking lot is in compliance currently, they can remain that way until such point as they either restripe or repave or change the outline of that particular parking surface.
And then they would need to update it?
Correct.
Correct. Thank you.
Okay. Director Black, did this, I know it's not it's just bringing it up to the state code, but was this run through the advisory commission?
I don't believe we took this to the advisory commission. I think it just simply went to the planning and zoning commission. Yeah. I'm happy to take that to them.
I'm sure there's not going to be any objections because we're just taking it to the state level, but it probably is something that we should just make sure that they're aware we're bringing ours to that. Thank you. I'm not seeing any further questions. We have a motion to receive and file. Councilmember Akison, seconded by Councilman Reagan Black. If there's no further discussion, please cast your ballots. That motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
We're at regular business. 19-101 is a request to concur with the recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission and staff to deny an ordinance approving a special use in a Class CN neighborhood commercial district for auto sales, repair, and service for properties located at 314 to 318 South Olive Street.
Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to move for approval of the denial.
Okay. So it's a motion. It's a motion to deny.
That's correct.
Right. Seconded by Councilman Riggenbach. I have a motion to concur with the denial. Any discussion on this? Seeing none, please cast your ballots. That motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
We're at unfinished business. 18-231 is a request to approve the purchase of the Samantle property located at the foot of Spring Street.
Mr. Manager.
Thank you. We have received the appraisals on the properties, the Rocky Glen and Riverplex properties. They have been sent to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and National Park Service. But at this time, we just ask for another deferral until we hear back from the state or federal government.
Okay. Is there a motion? Motion by Councilman Moore for the deferral, seconded by Councilman Graham. Any discussion on the deferral? Councilman Euler?
That's okay. I do have a question. When do we have to address the purchase agreement again?
We'll have to address that before the end of the month if we don't hear back from, or before the end of next month if we don't hear back from the federal government and the state government. As part of the submission when we sent the appraisals in, we did ask for a 30-day extension simply because they were closed for 35 days due to the federal shutdown, and We had some questions on the appraisals that we needed to get answers from them. If we don't have that extension, we will have to act within the end of this month, so or in the end of, but before the end of April. So it will be coming back at one point in time for your action if we don't get that extension. So,
thank you,
Councilman Sear.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Manager, if we defer tonight, will it cost us another $5,000 for the option?
No.
Thank you, sir.
Seeing no further lights, we have a motion and a second for a deferral. Please cast your ballots. Motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
18-275 is a request to approve an amendment of Chapter 13 of the Code of the City of Peoria pertaining to refuse containers.
Councilman Montalongo.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to defer this item to our next meeting. There's one last tweak that needs to happen in this.
Okay. Motion to defer, seconded by Councilman Sear. Discussion on this deferral. Seeing none, please cast your ballots. The motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
19-051 is a request to adopt an ordinance establishing and implementing a program to charge mitigation rates to non-residents for the deployment of emergency and non-emergency services by the fire department for services rendered by the Peoria Fire Department.
Mr. Manager, did you want to just clarify the changes that were made to this one?
Yes, we did amend this ordinance after the discussion that we had with the council to just include non-residents, so there would be no billing of city residents at all for this service. So we're really just focused right now on sending those charges out to those people that do not reside inside the city of Peoria.
Okay. Any questions on this one? Councilmember Jensen.
So does that mean that the bill is going to go out to the out-of-town resident or to their insurance company?
Both.
Pardon?
Both. I would imagine that they're going to try and they'll ascertain if that they have insurance, or they'll send it to the resident.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Reckriegel.
Question on how we're determining the out-of-town resident. We've got a lot of college students. We've got businesses that are here. They are located, headquartered in Peoria, but they may have vehicles outside.
If your driver's license says that you don't live in the city of Peoria, you will get billed.
Okay. What about for businesses that they are located here, but their cars may be titled in a different office? So, which is very common among a lot of businesses. They've got multiple locations.
Okay. We'll have to look at it.
It's not billed to the car.
Right.
So it's billed to the, like I said, the individual's address will be on their driver's license. They are either a resident of the city of Peoria or they are not a resident of the city of Peoria. And it's not where the car is located.
And so for our college students or people who are coming into ICC North and going, to that campus to go to class, if their license says that they are from East Peoria or Dunlap or Bartonville and something happens, we'll be sending them a bill?
Just as any other one, yes. Any outside resident will be receiving a bill that they're using a service if they're not paying for it in the city of Peoria.
Here's my concern on this is, and I think we put a task in front of the fire department to be able to raise revenue. So I don't think that, and I think it's unfair to do that to the fire department in this case. We're looking for what we think would be $200,000. We don't know really what that number is going to be. And Peoria is supposed to be a business-friendly community right now. We are the center of our region. We rely heavily on sales tax dollars and people who come into our area to work. That's why we're spending a lot of money in the downtown area and the warehouse district and out north to be able to encourage businesses and people to come in. and I don't cite the fire department with doing this. They did the task that we asked them to do, which is to bring us revenue sources. Not all revenue sources are created equal. I think this sends the wrong message to those who really want to come in to do business in our community. If you're asking somebody who has their office, and it might be I'm thinking of quite a few businesses that are located within the city limits of Peoria that have employees where they may be coming in from right outside the city lines. That doesn't send a really good message about where they want to locate. It's one more thing that says we're not open for business. And I don't think that's true about what we say and about what we really do. So I won't be voting in favor of this, not because I don't appreciate the efforts from the fire department. I think they should be applauded for this. I think it was the wrong message that we as city council sent to them.
I have Councilman Riggenbach next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I voted for this during the budget cycle. I shared the story multiple times about my daughter being in Carbondale and getting billing from the city of Carbondale on this. And if we could limit this to people who live in Carbondale, I'd support it wholeheartedly. But you know what? As I've gone through this in the last 2 weeks, I think Councilman Ruckriegel's right that Peoria is not Carbondale. We are the center. It's called the Greater Peoria area for a reason. And this is going to leave a $200,000 or less, perhaps, hole that we'll have to plug. But I can't support this because it's going against so many of the other efforts we're making right now in the city. Thank you.
I have Councilman Euler next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question relates to the amount of revenue that's projected. How has that changed from the original proposal that had residents to non?
The number's going to be less because we're going to be billing out of city residents, and I think that one of the challenges is, as Councilman Ruckriegel said, we just don't know what those numbers are going to be. I know the chief has had some conversations with Fire Recovery Services about that, and I'll defer to him to add any additional context in that regard.
Yes, Councilman, sorry. Even in the $200,000, we took what we thought was a respectable number from other cities that are using this service. The number of calls that they run compared to the number of calls that we run. So, again, it was we'll call it a calculated shot in the dark with the $200,000 in itself. We obviously have less outside people who get in accidents in the city of Peoria, so that number will go down. How much significantly, we don't know. And again, because we haven't done this program yet, we were going off of projected numbers as it was. It's going to be really hard to look at year to year. We can look back on a 10-year average, I guess, of outside residents who get in accidents in the city of Peoria. But again, that number is going to vary. So the easy answer is we don't know exactly, but it will. We anticipate it to be less than the total billing system that we are anticipating to move forward with.
Thanks for answering that question. Just general comment. When this initially came up, the conversation was more focused on insurance billing of people that didn't live here, and I found that more palatable, I think, as many around the horseshoe did, which is why it got passed into the budget and the contract discussion. But I'm concerned with the level of these fees and what the impact that will have on somebody whose insurance chooses not to pay it, especially that college student who's driving a $1,000 car that gets totaled and then has a $1,500, $2,500 bill for the accident itself. I think that it causes a potentially undue burden when that bill has to be paid out cash. Thank you.
I have Councilwoman Moore next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have a question and then a request. The question is to the city manager. If the funds come in less, as Chief Olahai has indicated, do we have reserve funding that we could apply to bear if this were to pass tonight?
If the funds come in less, I mean, that's something that we could certainly watch and see where we are as far as the overall budget. At this point in time, I'm not recommending that you cut the fire department's budget by $200,000 if you don't adopt this, but I'm just we can identify and look at that and see as the year progresses what the fee is going to be generating and provide you a regular update about what that number looks like should this pass. But it would not be my recommendation tonight that we go back and cut the fire department by additional $200,000.
So my first request is that we, if I recall correctly, Chief, didn't you say a month or so ago that we could not identify, if we went back and looked at the last year or two, we couldn't tell who was from out of town and who was, and if there was an accident, what that would have looked like for this funding stream?
I think the question that was asked of me is if we could identify, first off, how many of the out-of-town people, which we are able to do, that we can go back and get, whether or not they have insurance and those types of things, who would be billed, we are not able to do. Okay. So, we can tell you the number of accidents that were happening from outside people. We just can't tell you, if it would be their insurance, if it would have been them, what the recovery rate would have been from those people, those types of things. We just don't have any way to do that. So, yes, we can find you the numbers of accidents, and it's accidents. And if you will recall, we already bill outside people for car fires and extrications. And that's already a policy that we do. That's substantially less that we're charging them than this would be. So some of those numbers are already there. We haven't done it a lot. We haven't had a lot of extrications or car fires. Way more just standard accidents.
Okay, thank you. And with that, Mr. Mayor, and considering that we're looking for another 2 or 2.5 weeks for some information from Fitch, and then another 2.5 months for some additional information, I'd like to move to table this item until we have all information in.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Seconded by Councilman Riggenbach. Pardon me? It's the motion to table. There's a motion and a second. Okay. So we have anybody that would like to, well, I guess the motion to table is not debatable. So we just make the vote. Okay. The motion on the floor is to table. Please cast your ballots. The motion passes with 6 ayes and 5 nays, voting aye, Mayor Ardis, Councilmembers Akeson, Sear, Jensen, Moore, and Riggenbach. Madam Clerk.
So, Mr. Mayor, can I ask what I'm bringing back? I missed, what are we?
Nothing for right now. It's tabled. Thank you. Councilman Grib?
Is this matter concluded, or could I make a suggestion when it is brought back, placed on the table?
If it ever is, or when it is?
Well, if it is, one of the things I would like us to consider, because this is metamorphosed, it's changed from when it was first rolled out, it was going to affect Peoria residents. I would like some consideration given to students being considered residents if it can be demonstrated that they're here 9 months out of the year. I think that's reasonable. If they're living here 9 months out of the year, I consider them a resident, regardless of what's on their driver's license. The problem with this whole thing is it seems mean-spirited. However, the chief points out we do this as it relates to some accidents and certain things that happen in accidents now. We're needing to fund public safety. But I do think those who are here 9 months out of the year as students need to be exempted from anything that we would bring back, place on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Clerk.
If there's no further unfinished business,
I think we have one more item of unfinished business on the agenda.
I'm sorry, I wrote table by the wrong one. 19-064 is a recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission and staff to adopt an ordinance amending Appendix A, the Unified Development Code relating to off-premise signs.
Director Black.
Thank you. This is an item that came before the council, I believe, a couple of meetings ago as a first reading. The only change that has been made in this, based on some conversation that occurred at that council meeting, is instead of setting a specific number in the ordinance in terms of the maximum number of off-premise signs, which are more commonly known as billboards, what we will do is have a 90-day period where the signs will be inventoried, and that will establish the total number. So effectively, the number of signs will not change that are permitted within the city of Peoria. What changes is that it becomes much more flexible for billboard companies to move signs to different parts of the city, whereas right now the current ordinance is highly restrictive in terms of location. So this cleans up a lot of issues in terms of rather obtuse language, and creates, I think, a better understanding for both the regulatory part and also for companies that are involved in billboards.
Thank you. Motion to approve, Councilman Regenbach, seconded by Councilmember Moore. Is there discussion on this item? I'd just like to thank the staff in the manager's office for a lot of work that's gone into this over many months, and for the patience of some of our local businesses that have been impacted by this or potentially impacted like this. I think we came to a good resolution. Please cast your ballots. Motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk.
If there's no further unfinished business.
Unfinished business. Do we have any unfinished? Councilwoman Moore? Oh, not unfinished. Were you unfinished, Councilman? Okay. Councilman Montalongo.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. City Manager, I was wanting to get a report back on the stormwater utility fee for 2018 dollars collected, and hopefully we have that by address. Also dollars spent, and I know we had plenty of discussion hearing 400 plus projects. I'd like to see what those details are on which projects got completed and the dollar amount spent. And I know there's some dollars that were allocated for administrative dollars spent there as well. Just kind of a reconciled wrap-up of 2018 and what 2019 is going to look like as well.
Okay, thank you. Any unfinished business, further unfinished? Madam Clerk. Oh, I'm sorry, Councilman.
One other item during our budget discussions, Mr. City Manager, you had requested, I forget exactly the amount, somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000 for at-risk youth, and just like to see where that money has been spent.
Seeing no further lights for unfinished business, Madam Clerk.
We'd be at new business.
New business, Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to make two announcements. On this coming Saturday, March 30th, from 9 a.m. to noon at Peoria High, there will be a construction and manufacturing career forum. So if individuals who are interested in learning about the trades, finding out about benefits and wages and retirement and insurance and other issues or concerns about working in the trades, they are invited to come out to Peoria High. That's at 1615 North Street from 9 a.m. until noon on this coming Saturday. So if you've ever gone to this, it's all of the trades are out there. They're providing a lot of information, really encouraging folks to get involved. Everybody. We don't have a population where everyone even wants a college degree. Whether they want to go or not is not the subtopic. It's whether they want a college degree or not. And so this is an alternative for a high-paying job. The other announcement is on April the 4th at the Gateway Building from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. there will be a riverfront planning public meeting. And so this public meeting is going to address the platform area where there used to be a platform and there's no longer a platform, but there's a patch of grass. And so what we're going to be looking for are residents to come out and give us suggestions of what you'd like to see on that property. We're not necessarily looking for any construction, but what do you want to see? What kind of activities would you like to see there? What kind of vision do you have for that location? So that's April the 4th at the Gateway Building from 5 until 7 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other new business tonight? New business? I just have one quick one. It's some folks that are very focused on the cleanliness of our community are putting on an event that is supporting picking up trash in parks and beaches for the Trash Tag Challenge. So they're calling it the Riverfront Pound Trash Tag Pickup Challenge. So Nick Southey and Chelsea Marie and a group of other folks are organizing an event that's going to happen on April the 7th, and I'm mentioning it tonight because we won't have a meeting before then. So April 7th, they're going to meet by the CEFCU stage and split up into groups that are going to clean up different directions along the riverfront. And PDC has volunteered to help us with some trash bags and some toters for the stuff they pick up and so on. If anyone's interested, Stacy Peterson, who is our communications director, will have all this information up on the city website tomorrow. We would like to thank the folks that are taking the initiative to put this on, and I'd like to encourage as many people as possible to head down to the CEFCU stage on on April the 7th at I think I said 10 a.m., 11 a.m., 10 a.m. It'll be on the website tomorrow. With that done, Madam Clerk.
Yes, we would be at citizens' opportunity to address the City Council.
Thank you. Citizens to address, we just need your name for the record and 5-minute speaking limit. And up first is Lavetta Ricca.
Lavetta Ricca, President of Old Town South Neighborhood Association. I didn't think I'd be able to talk myself in to being happy and sad at the same time, but I have, because I'm happy for Councilman Eric Turner that the time is coming when he can hang up his running shoes and put on his slippers and relax the rest of his life and enjoy himself. But I'm really, really, really sad that he's leaving. Councilman Eric Turner and I go back a long way, a long way. I was thinking this morning, if we put on one of them apparatuses on his arm that the runners have to keep track of the miles they've walked or ran, he would be in the thousands, because he's done a lot of walking and a lot of good things for this city. And especially, he's helped me. He's helped me and the people of the South Side so much. I can't even begin to tell you the times that I've called him, and he's been right there. So with a heavy heart, I wish you all the good things in your life. But I do hate to see you go.
Just wait till that first meeting in May if you think that was bad. Next, we have Carrie Ohms.
Carrie Ohms, Friends of Riverfront Park, the president of that group. I'm coming today or tonight to talk about 18231, the once again deferral of the Semantle purchase. Tonight we heard about different things about fire service and other services in our city that we need to, be able to fund. And the Semantle purchase, City Manager Urick has both the appraisals in, but unfortunately, in consulting with the MAI review appraisers, there again seems to be some interesting information in the appraisals under the highest and best use for the Rocky Glen proposal, parcel, it says for private recreational use and potential development of limited residential uses. And when you look at the letters from the Office of Evaluation Services from the National Park Service that was for this property before, it says for recreation to be a valid highest and best use, it would require that some sort of profitability or return of value to the land. And there's nothing in this appraisal that gives you any kind of profitability for this land. Additionally, the comparables that were used aren't in the same zoning classifications and therefore don't necessarily have the highest and best use. And there are other problems. I'm just trying to make it as simple as I can for you tonight. And on the other one, on the Riverfront Park, its highest and best use is commercial and residential uses, which again is very vague because there's many different types of commercial. What I thought was incredibly interesting is that these are retrospective appraisals. So they were done in 2019 for a 2015 date. And on that, two of the comparables are the Spring Street option for Mr. Semantle's property and the option for the Detweiler Playground. So options aren't allowed to be used as comparable cells. And additionally, in the narrative, the appraiser says that the options have never been exercised, and we know that the Detweiler Playground option was exercised. And then there was a portfolio cell, there was assemblage cells. These cells, again, also don't qualify because they're not the same zoning classification and the highest and best use, and on and on. Why is this so important? Friends of Riverfront Park, they got what they wanted. There's no development in the park because that's what the people wanted and to preserve the public park. Why is this so important? Because the only option that continues to be put before the City Council for months, we're going to soon probably be on the 9th extension for the Semantle property if it doesn't get resolved by the end of April, is because $500,000 on a bond will be $1 million over the life of the bond. We need to look at other options. In the City Council communication, the city manager has said that we could look at other things. We would maybe have to start over. You need to not spend $500,000. We don't need to be spending $145,000 to buy Mr. Semantle's property, to remediate it, to remediate the L-shaped parcel that is right by that property. It was $41,000 4 years ago for just the remediation estimate for Mr. Semantle's. That's another $41 or plus inflation. We just need to look at some other options. And because we strongly feel, not only based on what we have found, but in consultation with the MIA review appraiser, when these if these appraisals are rejected, then we don't even know that the $92,000 that's being claimed as a missing fair market value is really $92,000 because the appraisals, once again, are not correct. You need, I know you think, oh, all she does is go into details. But the small stuff is what is important, okay? Just like the mitigation thing with the fire thing. You said that you had to have a license that said Peoria on it, otherwise I would be considered a non-resident. Don't we have properties in Dunlap and those people pay Peoria City property taxes? Aren't they residents? The details matter. You can't tax us more. You've got to spend less. We're going to have to cut services and stay in the budget. There needs to be some kind of a meeting so we can look at other options to not spend $500,000. Thank you.
We have Calissa Armstrong next.
Alyssa Armstrong. I'm from the 9, a local business in downtown Peoria. As I'm standing up here, I wish I would have been in English class and stood in front of the class a little bit more because it's a little nerve-wracking up here. But what I come here today for is because I have been trying to, bless you, I have been trying to apply for my liquor license for my business for quite some time now. And what I'm actually coming to you with, because I'll give you the exact scenario of what's happening. In 2005, the business I was in, the location that I'm in, has been shut down. They are called Downstate Enterprises. The owner of that is actually called Catherine Dans. The owner of the building is Warren Dans, and then you have me, the new tenant, Calissa Armstrong of the New Empire LLC. So right now, what I'm being told is that my liquor license is being held up because apparently Warren Dans has a case against the city for being shut down back in 2005, when it's actually Catherine Dans who has the case because she's over at Downstate Enterprises. And so my question is how, from someone who's been in my building back in 2005, and they're now since moved out of that location, and they've been closed for 15 years now, can affect my liquor license. I've done everything I've asked of me. I've did the proper applications, did with all the meetings, and yet I'm being told that unless this corporation or enterprise does what they're asked to do as far as dropping the case or moving to do something else with their case, that my business cannot move forward. And I'm just trying to see how my business, my happiness, my rights depend on somebody else's. Because if this case has been in court for 14 years now, obviously they have no sense of urgency or anything like that. I wanted to bring this to the liquor license earlier in March with these questions, and I wasn't even told that the liquor meeting had been canceled. It said due to lack of cases it's been canceled, but mine was the only one on the docket. So it led me believe that my business is so insignificant to not even get notified or to even be heard, even if I'm the only one on the docket, for me to be able to speak out about this situation for this month's meeting, since it was canceled. So my thing is, since this case has absolutely nothing to do with my business or anything like that, and I haven't done anything wrong, if there's something that can be done to where I can be able to open up my doors to the public with a liquor license, whether it be temporarily until they figure out what they're doing with this liquor license, with this case that they're doing, or if it's something that they can be able to move aside so that I can be able to, the new tenant in this building can be able to be able to open up. Because right now I'm losing a lot of money. I've put my life savings, my dreams, everything into this business, and now it's getting to the point where it's either walk away from it all or continue to lose more things, because I've already lost my house to this. I've put up everything that I've had in order to get more money. I can't even do a fundraiser with trying to get a temporary liquor license, because they told me that I'll need to be a charity and be established for a year. So I'm hoping that there can be at least some sort of special meeting and for my case, so that I can be able to move forward without having to be attached to a business from 14 years ago that I have absolutely nothing to do with. I know there's some council members who know of my story, and they've sat down with me, given me some advice, but to actually have something telling me exactly why I'm being held up because of this would be really nice, an actual real explanation of what's going on, why my due process is being held up, my rights are being held up for this situation. Thank you.
Just for the city council, I'd ask the corporation council to just write up a summary that we can include in the issues this week, just so everybody understands the timeline and the issues with that location. Next up is Alicia Collins.
Good afternoon. My name is Alicia Collins. I'm an entrepreneur here in Peoria, Illinois, as well as a property owner and a property investor. I was here back last year, September 2019, and I'm here to speak my voice to see some change in the city for equal opportunity, especially for blacks, minorities in the Peoria city. I am the owner of Secrets Lounge that is held on 1801 Southwest Adams, and I came last year for a liquor license, well, for a site approval, and the Liquor Commission denied me in September. So I came across the article again. I never went through to bring it to city. I took it back. I brought it back in December 11th, and the Liquor Commission recommended me to come in front of the city. And I spoke with my district council lady, Denise Moore, who was eye to eye with me on the possibilities of getting this license. But I had the owner of UFS petition because of past ordeals that happened at that site that had nothing to do with me. I have made a difference in the city. I have invested time, hours, and money into making a difference when it comes to community outreach. I've brought celebrities here to make a difference when it comes to creating job opportunities. I'm actually having an event on Friday where over 20 small businesses will be involved at the Peoria Scottish Rite, where I have to rent and pay for a space where I own a business and I'm not able to be granted certain license to accommodate people. This is for the city of Peoria to create opportunities and jobs that blacks have been rejected, which is shown in the on the news on 11, 12, 18, ABC News for being the 5th worst city for jobs here for Peoria. I am one of the citizens in Peoria of many more that are trying to make a difference to crack down crime, to crack down unemployment, to give the city of Peoria blacks opportunity, an outlet to be able to flourish and to be able to be more civilized and be able to conduct themselves. So moving forward with this year's election, I just want to see more opportunities for blacks in the city of Peoria. Thank you.
Up next, we have Spanky Edwards.
Spanky Edwards. I preside at 1209 East Fry. I'm here because I just moved back a year ago, and I went to Peoria High. I'm a long life citizen, and I opened a food truck. My mom decided to open a food truck in Peoria, and so she was struggling because of city ordinances and the different things that she had to challenge that had absolutely nothing to do with food, or safety of food, the sanity of food. It had nothing to do with abusing employees or not paying our taxes. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the city does not want food trucks here. And I remember that, Mr. Mayor, when the food trucks was first an idea, maybe about 5 years ago, how you decided to give brick and mortars an advantage over us. Living in Nashville and Atlanta, Georgia, gives food trucks give an opportunity for small Peorians to live an American dream. Now, what you've seen here before me was 2 African American dreamers. We have an opportunity to make changes in our life, to also build upon our legacy. And if we do things right, Alicia has the key to the city. What does that say to the rest of us? If she can't open a liquor license in a building that was a tavern for 60 years because of the owner of UFS, who they will be operating in 2 different time spans, we don't vote for Pierre. He has a right to think whatever he wants to. But the city sided with him and denied her and her partners, who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to be invested in this building, and you sided with him. Now, I'm not saying that you are racist or that Pierre is racist, but what I will say is that you sided on the side of racist, stereotypical ideas. The ideas that black people cannot handle their liquor. The ideas that black people all over Peoria are the same, that when they get drunk, they become violent, that they can't do business, that one news cycle where something will happen bad at her establishment will cause negative impact on a business that has been there since I've been in Peoria, since I was born. So what we know are the facts. UFS, as far as Alicia's building is concerned, was fine before Karina's and Secrets. It was fine during, while Karina and Secrets is there, and is doing fine now. So there is nothing to suggest that even if something dangerous was to happen, that it would affect his business negatively. So we're disheartened that Councilwoman Moore approved it. She got past the Liquor Commission. She paid her fines and fees, and everything was right. And when she came up here, the motion didn't get a second. Now, she shouldn't have to be a celebrity. She should be an average Peorian with not any privilege and have the ability to do business in this city. Same thing with the lady that spoke before her. I call her Kizzy, Miss Alexander, who has spent her whole life savings trying to participate in the American dream and is being stifled at City Hall. We have some problems here. I've been working with them, and it's all of us. We want to bring a space that is a cultural space for us, where we can take our colleagues, young black professionals, and we can have happy hours, live music, and a dance floor where we can enjoy ourselves. And every step of the way, it seems as if the council, or if it's the zoning or whatever it is, we're not being able to be successful in this manner. There is no bar in Peoria, no black-owned bar that owns a building and has a 4 o'clock license. Even with Pierre P. Mills, he has a 1 o'clock license with a 12 o'clock music curfew, and there's nowhere down in Peoria in the 1st District where that is. So, and those are the facts. So why would we not take our business to East Peoria, Chillicothe, or Dunlap, or somewhere other area who has been more welcoming to us? I understand that the time is up, but these are serious issues. These are reasons why Peoria ranks top 5 with as far as black people's experience here. This is why the people who have the ability to make the changes here are being stifled. Now, we want to work with you. We have done everything the right way.
Mr. Edwards,
none of us are troublemakers.
I just need you to wrap it up. We usually cut it off right at 5.
I understand
and now that you've moved back to
we're
town,
we're talking about people, their lives here, and there's even a real reason why you didn't tell Alicia or Miss Alexander why there are bars here. So if I'm taking up too much of your time, then so be it. I mean, what else can we do? Do we have to protest and come to your offices? Do we have to shut down stuff? But we will. Is that what we have to resort to? To be uncivil when we have been civil? Thank you.
Madam Clerk.
We have an executive session.
Mr. Leist.
Yes, Your Honor. A motion would be appropriate pursuant to Section 2C1 of the Illinois Open Meetings Act, which exempts discussions relative to the performance of specific employees, as well as 2C5, an exemption that exempts the discussion of acquisition of real property, and 2C11, which exempts the discussion of pending or imminent litigation, and finally 2C21, which exempts approval of previously closed minutes.
We have a motion to go into executive session by Councilman Sear, seconded by Councilman Graham. Please cast your ballots. That motion passes unanimously, and we have a motion to adjourn by Councilman Sear and seconded by Councilman Graham. Please cast your ballots. That motion also passes unanimously. We'd like to thank H. Wayne Wilson and his listening audience at WCBU as well as Cable Channel 22, and this meeting is adjourned.